Case File 1929, The Last Scream on Wall Street, the morning of the 29th of October, 1929. New York City wakes under a pale autumn sky, but inside the financial district, something is already wrong. The air feels tight, the way it feels before a storm nobody has named yet. Men in dark suits move faster than usual down Broad Street. Newspaper boys shout headlines that are already stale by the time the ink dries. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange rings. It sounds the same as it always does, a short, sharp, metallic note. But this time, it does not sound like an invitation to trade. It sounds like a starting gun. Inside the exchange, the noise begins instantly. Telephones ring and they do not stop ringing. Every line is a broker. Every broker is shouting a sell order, and every sell order makes the next one more desperate. Ticker tape machines chatter without pause, spitting out ribbons of paper covered in symbols and numbers, numbers that are falling faster than the machines can even print them. By midday, the tape is running so far behind the actual prices that nobody in the building really knows, minute to minute, how much money has already disappeared. Outside, on Wall Street itself, a crowd is gathering. It grows by the hour. Clerks, investors, shoeshine boys, secretaries, all pressing toward the steps of the exchange, drawn by rumor and fear in equal measure. Police officers are called in, not for a riot yet, but because nobody is sure what a crowd like this will do next. Now picture the numbers themselves. A share that was worth $100 the week before is being sold for $40, then $30, then whatever anyone will pay for it at all. Fortunes that took decades to build are being erased in the space of a single trading session. Men who were millionaires when they had breakfast are, by the time they eat dinner, in debt for the rest of their lives. Panic does not stay polite. It spreads. Investors are not just selling, they are begging to sell, throwing shares onto the market at any price, because any price today is better than no price tomorrow. Banks, the very institutions that were supposed to be the safest place for a person's money, begin to shake under the pressure. Depositors start lining up outside bank doors, afraid that their savings will vanish along with everything else. And then come the rumors. Whispers move through the crowd faster than any newspaper can print them. Stories that a wealthy man has jumped from the window of a hotel. Stories that a broker has thrown himself from an office high above the street. Some of these stories are true. Many of them are not. But in 1929, in the middle of the worst single week Wall Street has ever seen, the line between rumor and fact has almost completely disappeared, and fear itself becomes as contagious as the selling. Here is the mystery this book was written to solve. How does the richest nation on earth, a country that only a few years earlier seemed to have discovered a permanent formula for prosperity, collapse in a matter of days? How do millions of ordinary people, farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, school teachers, wake up one morning with savings and wake up a few mornings later with nothing at all? Is it true that hundreds of investors climbed to the tops of Wall Street's buildings and jumped, or is this one of the great myths of American history, a story that grew larger with every year that passed? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, in a disaster that destroyed so many, was there anyone who came out ahead? Was there a hand quietly profiting while the rest of the country burned? This book exists to answer those questions, one piece of evidence at a time. We will follow the case file from its very first page, tracing the decisions, the personalities, and the blind confidence that built the greatest bubble the world had ever seen. We will take that bubble apart, layer by layer, and examine exactly what was inside it. The borrowed money, the unchecked speculation, the banks that gambled with money that was never theirs to risk. And we will ask what remains true today, nearly a century later. Because the crash of 1929 did not just destroy a market, it rewrote the rules of an entire financial system, and many of those lessons are still being tested in different forms in every generation since. This is the story of the day Wall Street screamed. Let us begin at the beginning, before the bell, before the crowd, before anyone knew that the 29th of October would become a date the world would never forget. Chapter 1. The Roaring Twenties. When all of America believed it would be rich forever. To understand why Wall Street screamed on the 29th of October 1929, we have to go back almost a full decade earlier, to the smoking ruins of a war that had just destroyed an entire continent. The First World War ended in November of 1918, and when the smoke cleared, the map of global power had quietly but permanently shifted. Europe, the old center of the world's wealth, lay in pieces. Its factories were bombed out, its farmland was cratered. Its young men, the very workers and soldiers who should have been rebuilding it, were dead by the millions. France was in debt. Britain was in debt. Germany was crushed under reparations it could barely comprehend, let alone pay. And on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, almost untouched by the physical destruction of the war, stood the United States. America had entered the war late, had suffered comparatively few casualties, and had spent the war years selling weapons, food, and industrial goods to its allies. When the fighting stopped, the United States was no longer simply one power among many. It was, for the first time in its history, the single largest economy on the face of the earth. It held more gold reserves than any other nation. It had become the world's largest creditor, the country that other nations now owed money to, rather than the other way around. Capital began to flow toward America the way water flows downhill. European investors, desperate for stability, sent their money across the ocean. American banks, flush with cash and confidence, began lending it out again just as quickly. New York, and specifically the narrow streets of its financial district, became the beating heart of a new global economy, one where the old empires of London and Paris now looked, quietly, to Wall Street for direction. This was the foundation. But a foundation of wealth alone does not explain what happened next. What happened next was a revolution, not of politics, but of everyday life. Before the war, for most American families, a great many comforts had been considered luxuries reserved for the wealthy. After the war, they became something else entirely. They became expectations. Consider the automobile. In the years before the war, a car was still something of a novelty, expensive, temperamental, and rare outside the cities. By the middle of the 1920s, thanks largely to mass production techniques pioneered by men like Henry Ford, the automobile had become something an ordinary factory worker could actually imagine owning. Assembly lines turned out cars faster and cheaper than anyone had thought possible. Roads were paved to accommodate them. Gas stations sprang up along highways that had barely existed a decade before. Owning a car was no longer a symbol of the elite. It was becoming, for millions of families, simply a normal part of life. Then there was the radio. At the start of the 1920s, radio broadcasting for the general public barely existed. By the end of the decade, it was everywhere. Families gathered around wooden cabinets in their living rooms to listen to music, news, comedy programs, and advertisements, all beamed invisibly through the air from stations hundreds of miles away. For the first time in human history, a voice could be heard by millions of strangers in their own homes at the exact same moment. It was, in its own quiet way, just as revolutionary as the internet would be decades later. Electricity itself was spreading into homes that had never had it before, and with electricity came appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, toasters. Small conveniences that seem unremarkable today were, in the 1920s, genuine marvels, machines that promised to save hours of grinding, manual household labor every single week. And how did ordinary families afford all of this? Cars, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, often on wages that had not dramatically increased. The answer was a financial innovation that would prove just as important to this story as the stock market itself. Credit. Buying on credit, known at the time as installment buying, exploded in popularity throughout the decade. A family did not need to save for years to buy a car or a refrigerator. They could simply make a small down payment, sign an agreement, and take the item home immediately, paying off the rest in small amounts over the following months. It felt like magic. It felt like the future had arrived early, and it was available to anyone willing to sign a piece of paper. This culture of buying now and paying later did not stay confined to washing machines and automobiles. It would soon find its way into something far more dangerous, the stock market itself. But before we follow the money into Wall Street, we have to understand the mood of the country during these years, because The mood mattered just as much as the economics. Historians would later give this decade a nickname that has outlived almost everyone who lived through it: the Roaring Twenties. It was an era that seemed to roar with confidence, with noise, with color, after the gray exhaustion of war. In the biggest cities, a new kind of nightlife flourished. Prohibition had made the sale of alcohol illegal across the country, but rather than stopping people from drinking, it simply pushed the drinking underground into hidden clubs known as speakeasies, where jazz music played late into the night and rules seemed to bend, if not entirely break. Jazz itself became the sound of the decade, a wild, improvised, deeply American art form born largely out of black musical traditions in cities like New Orleans and Chicago, then spreading outward until it defined the rhythm of the entire era. Dance halls filled with young men and women moving to music their parents found scandalous. Skirts got shorter, hair got shorter. A new figure emerged in popular culture: the flapper, a young woman who smoked in public, danced without restraint, and openly rejected the quieter expectations of the generation before her. Hollywood, meanwhile, was transforming from a small regional curiosity into a genuine national obsession. Silent films gave way by the end of the decade to the first talking pictures. Movie palaces, enormous, ornately decorated theaters, opened in cities across the country, offering ordinary working people a taste of glamour that had previously belonged only to the very rich. Movie stars became a new kind of American royalty, their faces printed in newspapers and magazines, their lives followed with the same hunger that had once been reserved for kings and queens in older countries. Underneath all of this glittering culture, one particular idea took root, and it is this idea, more than any single event, that set the stage for the disaster to come. The idea was speculation, the belief that money itself could simply make more money, quickly, easily, and with very little risk, if only you knew where to put it. The stock market had existed for a very long time before the 1920s, but for most of its history, it had been the domain of professional financiers, wealthy families, and institutions. It was not, generally speaking, something the average shopkeeper or schoolteacher spent much time thinking about. That began to change dramatically as the decade wore on. Stories spread, first quietly, then loudly, of ordinary people who had turned modest sums into small fortunes simply by buying stock and watching its price climb. A shoeshine boy tells a customer he is investing in a particular railroad company. A elevator operator gives stock tips to the executives he rides up and down with every day. These stories, whether entirely true or somewhat exaggerated, spread through barbershops, dinner tables, and church gatherings, and they carried with them a single seductive promise. Anyone could get rich. All you had to do was buy. And so, throughout the middle and later years of the decade, more and more ordinary Americans, people who had never owned a single share of stock in their lives, began pouring their savings into the market. Farmers, secretaries, small business owners, even some who worked multiple jobs just to scrape together enough money to buy a few shares, joined a rising tide of new investors, all chasing the same dream. This alone might have been manageable if people had simply been investing money they already had. But that is not what happened. Just as families were buying cars and refrigerators on credit, a great many new investors began buying stock on credit as well, through a practice known as buying on margin. Buying on margin allowed an investor to purchase stock by paying only a small fraction of its actual price in cash, often as little as 10%, and borrowing the rest from a broker. If the stock's price rose, the investor could sell it, repay the loan, and pocket a profit that was far larger, proportionally, than the small amount of cash they had originally put in. It was an intoxicating arrangement, because it meant that even a modest rise in stock prices could produce enormous returns on the investor's original money. But this same arrangement contained, hidden inside its very structure, an enormous and largely unspoken danger. If the price of the stock fell instead of rose, the losses would be just as magnified as the gains had been. And if a great many investors were all borrowing money to buy the same rising stocks, then the entire system was quietly becoming a tower built not on solid ground, but on borrowed money resting on top of more borrowed money. Throughout the late 1920s, stock prices climbed almost without pause. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, a measurement of the overall health of the stock market, rose year after year, sometimes by staggering percentages within a single 12-month period. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating each new record high. Bankers and prominent economists appeared in print, some of them respected voices with genuine authority, declaring publicly that America had entered a permanent new era of prosperity, one in which the old cycles of economic boom and bust simply no longer applied. It became, in the closing years of the decade, almost a matter of common sense, a truth so widely accepted that few people bothered to question it out loud. Stock prices only go up. That was simply how things work now. Buy today because tomorrow it will cost more. Borrow if you must because the returns will more than cover the debt. This was not merely the belief of a few reckless speculators on Wall Street itself. It had become, remarkably, the working assumption of ordinary Americans across the entire country, from the biggest cities to the smallest farming towns. And here, at the very peak of this collective confidence, sits the first true clue in our investigation, the first piece of evidence that any careful detective examining this case would circle in red ink. No market in the entire recorded history of human commerce has ever risen forever. Prices that climb because more and more people believe they will keep climbing are not, in the end, measuring the actual value of anything real, of factories, of crops, of goods being produced and sold. They are measuring belief itself, and belief, however widespread, however confidently stated by bankers and economists in the newspapers, is not the same thing as truth. By the late summer of 1929, the American stock market had climbed to heights that bore less and less relationship to the actual earnings and value of the companies whose shares were being traded. A gap was opening, quietly, invisibly, to most of the public, between what stocks were worth on paper and what the businesses behind them were actually producing in the real world. Somewhere in that widening gap, unnoticed by the crowds still celebrating in speakeasies, still admiring their new radios, still signing installment agreements for their new automobiles, a single question was waiting to be answered. What happens when a market built on borrowed money and unshakable optimism finally runs out of new believers willing to buy in at the top? The answer to that question was only a few short weeks away, and when it arrived, it would arrive not gently but as a scream. Chapter 2. The machine that printed money. Its name was Wall Street. By the late 1920s, something remarkable had happened to the stock market. It had stopped being a private conversation among bankers and professional financiers, and it had become instead a national obsession, discussed at kitchen tables and factory lunch counters in almost every corner of the country. To understand how completely this fever had spread, it helps to look past the famous names, the bankers and industrialists whose portraits filled the newspapers, and look instead at the people who were not supposed to be part of this world at all. A department store clerk, standing behind a counter all day selling shoes or hats, would spend her lunch break reading the stock listings in the newspaper, watching a handful of shares she had bought with her savings, waiting to see if they had climbed another few points overnight. A school teacher, earning a modest and steady salary, would set aside a small portion of every paycheck, not into a savings account as his father might have done, but into shares purchased through a local broker, convinced that this new approach to saving would build a far larger nest egg than any bank interest ever could. A taxi driver, sitting in traffic between fares, would strike up conversations with his passengers, not about the weather or the news of the day, but about which stocks were rising, which company was said to be the next great opportunity, which tip, overheard from a well-dressed businessman in the back seat, might be worth acting on. A housewife, managing a household budget carefully every week, might quietly open her own small brokerage account, buying a handful of shares in a well-known company, hoping to build a private cushion of savings entirely her own. Even college students, young men just beginning their adult lives, pooled small amounts of money together, treating the market almost like a game, a shortcut to the kind of wealth that had once required a lifetime of careful work to achieve. This was the true defining feature of the late 1920s stock market. It was no longer simply a market. It had become something closer to a national lottery that everyone believed they could win if only they were willing to place a bet. But there was a problem hidden inside this democratization of investing. And the problem was this: a great many of these new investors, the clerks and teachers and taxi drivers and housewives, did not actually have very much money to invest in the first place. And this is where one particular financial tool, more than any other single factor, transformed a rising market into a ticking bomb. That tool was called buying on margin. And to understand the crash of 1929, you must understand exactly how it worked. Imagine a broker's office on any ordinary afternoon in 1928 or 1929. A customer walks in wanting to purchase shares of a well-known company, shares that might cost, in total, $1,000. Under a margin arrangement, this customer does not need to hand over the full $1,000 in cash. Instead, he needs to provide only a small fraction of that amount, often as little as 10%, which in this case would be just $100. The broker then lends the customer the remaining 90%, in this example $900, using the newly purchased stock itself as collateral for the loan. The customer walks out having purchased $1,000 worth of stock while having spent only $100 of his own money. If the price of that stock then rises, say by 10%, the customer's shares are now worth $1,100. He can sell them, repay the $900 loan to his broker, and walk away with $200 in his pocket, having doubled his original $100 investment from a stock that only rose by 10%. This magnifying effect, turning a modest gain in the stock's actual price into a dramatically larger gain for the investor, is precisely what made margin buying so intoxicating and so dangerous, because the exact same magnifying effect works in reverse. If the price of that stock falls instead of rises, even by a relatively small amount, the investor's tiny cushion of actual cash can be wiped out entirely, and he can suddenly find himself owing more money to his broker than his shares are even worth. By the peak of the market in the autumn of 1929, an enormous portion of all the money flowing into stocks was borrowed money of exactly this kind. Estimates from the period suggest that billions of dollars in margin loans were outstanding across the country, an amount that had grown dramatically over just a few short years. The market was no longer simply reflecting how much wealth Americans actually possessed. It was reflecting how much wealth they had borrowed, layered on top of a smaller foundation of genuine savings, like an enormous inverted pyramid balanced on a single narrow point. And it was not only individual investors taking on this kind of risk. Astonishingly, some of the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public's money were doing much the same thing. Banks across the country, entrusted with the ordinary deposits of everyday citizens, farmers putting aside money for next year's seeds, families saving for a home, small business owners setting aside their working capital, began quietly funneling portions of these deposits into the stock market themselves, either through direct investment or by making margin loans to their own customers, collecting fees and interest along the way. Investment trusts, a relatively new type of financial company that had exploded in popularity during these years, pooled money from thousands of ordinary investors and used it to buy large portfolios of stock, often themselves using borrowed money to amplify their purchasing power even further. Some of these trusts were built on top of other trusts, layers of borrowed money, stacked upon layers of borrowed money, so that by the time you trace the ownership all the way down to its foundation, the actual amount of real, unborrowed capital supporting the entire structure was a small fraction of what it appeared to be on paper. In this way, the banking system itself, the institution ordinary citizens trusted most with their hard-earned savings, had quietly become one of the largest gamblers at the table, wagering not just its own money, but the deposits of millions of everyday families who had no idea their savings were being placed at risk in this way. All of this borrowing, all of this speculation, needed something to sustain it, and that something was confidence. Endless, unshakable, ever-renewing confidence that prices would keep climbing. And here, the newspapers and popular magazines of the era played a role that historians have studied closely ever since. Open almost any major newspaper's financial pages during these years, and you would find story after story celebrating the market's rise. Headlines announced new record highs. Articles profiled ordinary citizens who had turned modest investments into surprising fortunes, framing these stories as inspiring proof that anyone with a little courage and a willingness to buy could achieve the same success. Prominent bankers and economists were quoted approvingly, offering reassurance that the market's climb was healthy, sustainable, and fully justified by America's bright economic future. What these same publications rarely printed, at least not with the same enthusiasm or prominence, were the more cautious voices. There were, in fact, a small number of economists and financial writers throughout the late 1920s who warned publicly that stock prices had climbed far beyond what the actual earnings of American companies could reasonably justify, that the market had become dangerously detached from economic reality. But these warnings were largely drowned out, treated as the pessimistic mutterings of men who simply did not understand the new economic era that America had supposedly entered. Skeptics were mocked, in some cases openly, as old-fashioned thinkers unable to grasp the modern age. This selective attention, celebrating every success story while dismissing every warning, created a powerful and self-reinforcing psychological effect, one that modern researchers studying financial behavior would later recognize as one of the very first large-scale examples of what we now call the fear of missing out, though the phrase itself would not be coined until many decades later. Consider how this fear operated in practice. A person reads in the newspaper about a neighbor, a coworker, or a complete stranger who invested a modest sum and made an extraordinary profit. That person does not want to be the only one left behind while everyone around him grows wealthier. He does not want to be the cautious fool who watched from the sidelines while his barber, his elevator operator, or his own brother-in-law became rich simply by buying stock. And so he buys too, often borrowing to do it. Often buying not because he has carefully studied the company whose shares he is purchasing, but simply because the price is rising and he does not want to miss his chance. Multiply this single decision across millions of individual investors, all making the same calculation at roughly the same time, and you begin to see how an entire national economy can be swept into a collective delusion, a shared belief that becomes, for a time, powerful enough to actually create the very reality it describes. Prices rise because people believe they will rise. And for a while, that belief alone is enough to make it true. But beliefs, however widely shared, are not the same thing as underlying value. And this brings us to the central piece of evidence in this chapter of our investigation, the secret buried at the heart of the entire 1929 bull market. By the final months before the crash, the stock market had almost entirely stopped reflecting the actual profits, actual sales, and actual future earnings of the companies whose shares were being traded. Instead, it had become a market built overwhelmingly on expectation, on the assumption that whatever a stock was worth today, it would simply be worth more tomorrow, regardless of what the underlying business was actually producing or earning. This is, in the end, the quiet, unglamorous truth hiding beneath all the glittering headlines and dinner table success stories of the era. A financial market can, for a surprisingly long stretch of time, rise on nothing more than the collective confidence of the people participating in it. Real earnings, real productivity, and real economic growth become almost secondary considerations, background noise, beneath the louder and more urgent question of what everyone else seems to believe the price will do next. And a market built primarily on expectation, rather than on the solid ground of genuine economic value, carries within it a single, unavoidable vulnerability. It requires a constant, ever-growing supply of new buyers, new believers, new sources of borrowed money flowing in to keep the price climbing. The moment that supply of new buyers begins to slow, even slightly, even for reasons that seem small or temporary at the time, the entire structure built on top of it becomes suddenly dangerously unstable. By the early autumn of 1929, that supply of new buyers was, without most people realizing it, beginning to reach its limit. The machine that had printed such extraordinary wealth for nearly a decade was running low on the one fuel it had always depended on most: New believers willing to keep buying at ever higher prices, no matter how far those prices had already drifted from reality. What happens to a machine like that when the fuel finally runs out is precisely where our investigation turns next. Chapter 3: The Giant Bubble, when greed clouded every calculation. There is a particular kind of moment that appears again and again throughout financial history, a moment when the price of something stops being connected to what that something is actually worth, and instead becomes connected only to what people believe someone else will pay for it tomorrow. By the summer of 1929, the American stock market had arrived fully and unmistakably at exactly this kind of moment. To understand how extreme this disconnection had become, it helps to look closely at the actual mathematics that investors of the era were quietly choosing to ignore. In a healthy, rational market, the price of a company's stock is supposed to reflect something real. It should reflect the company's current profits, the steady stream of income it earns from selling its actual products or services, and a reasonable expectation of how those profits might grow in the years ahead. When investors buy a share of stock, in theory, they are buying a small piece of a real functioning business, and the price they are willing to pay should rise and fall along with the genuine fortunes of that business. But by the later months of 1929, this relationship had, for an enormous number of stocks, essentially broken down. Prices were climbing month after month, sometimes week after week, while the actual revenues and actual profits of the companies behind those shares were rising far more slowly, or in a great many cases, not rising at all. Investors were no longer, in any meaningful sense, purchasing a share of a company's genuine present-day earning power. They were purchasing a bet, a wager that whatever price they paid today, someone else tomorrow or next week or next month would be willing to pay even more. This is the essential, deceptively simple engine at the heart of every speculative bubble in history, and 1929 was, in many ways, the moment this engine was demonstrated to the entire world on the largest scale anyone had yet witnessed. Price detaches from value. Value stops mattering. All that matters is the expectation of the next buyer's willingness to pay still more. What makes this kind of detachment so dangerous is not simply that it happens, but that it happens gradually enough and is validated loudly enough by respected voices that ordinary people rarely recognize it while it is occurring. And in the case of 1929, there was no shortage of respected voices offering exactly this kind of validation. Throughout the final years of the decade, a chorus of prominent economists, university professors, and financial commentators offered the American public a comforting and remarkably confident explanation for the market's seemingly endless rise. America, they argued, had entered a genuinely new economic era, one fundamentally different from anything that had come before it. The old patterns of economic history, the familiar cycles of boom followed inevitably by bust, they suggested, simply no longer applied to modern industrialized America. Advances in mass production, in scientific management, in electrification, and transportation had, according to this view, permanently transformed the underlying machinery of the American economy, making sustained, uninterrupted growth not merely possible but essentially guaranteed going forward. One particularly well-known economist, a respected professor at a prestigious university, famously declared in the days just before the crash that stock prices had reached what he described as a permanently high plateau, a phrase that would later be remembered with considerable irony as one of the most confidently wrong predictions in American economic history. He was not alone in this confidence. Bankers, financial journalists, and even government officials offered similarly reassuring pronouncements throughout 1929, each one adding further legitimacy to the widespread belief that the ordinary rules of economic gravity had simply stopped applying. This chorus of expert reassurance mattered enormously because it gave ordinary investors, people without any specialized financial training of their own, permission to stop asking hard questions. If respected professors and prominent bankers, men presumed to understand economics far better than any shoeshine boy or department store clerk, were confidently declaring that the market's rise was sound and sustainable, why should an ordinary citizen doubt them? And it was not only ordinary citizens who were swept up in this collective confidence. Some of the most prominent and admired figures in American public life, men and women, whose judgment was widely respected across the entire country, were themselves deeply invested in the market, and in many cases spoke publicly and enthusiastically about their own successful investments. Well-known politicians, some serving at the very highest levels of the United States government, held significant stock market investments of their own, and in certain cases offered public statements of confidence in the economy that, whether intended this way or not, functioned as a kind of implicit endorsement of the market's continued rise. Prominent businessmen, industrialists whose companies had genuinely thrived during the economic boom of the decade, appeared frequently in newspapers discussing their investment successes, further reinforcing the impression that intelligent, successful people simply did not lose money in this market. Popular entertainers and public figures from the worlds of theater and early film, celebrities whose lives were followed closely by an adoring public, were likewise known to speculate actively in stocks, their visible enthusiasm adding yet another layer of glamour and legitimacy to what was, underneath all of the excitement, an increasingly reckless national gamble. When the wealthy, the powerful, and the famous all appear to be participating enthusiastically in the very same activity, it becomes remarkably difficult for an ordinary person to believe that activity could possibly be dangerous. Surely, the thinking went, these are not foolish or reckless people. Surely they understand something the average citizen does not. And so their visible participation served, whether intentionally or not, as one more powerful signal, telling millions of everyday Americans that it was not only safe to keep buying, but almost foolish not to. Beneath all of this celebration and reassurance, however, a careful investigator looking back at the economic record of the late 1920s can identify a series of warning signs, signs that were, at the time, largely dismissed, overlooked, or simply drowned out by the louder and more comforting narrative of permanent prosperity. The first of these warning signs involved debt, and specifically the astonishing speed at which debt was accumulating throughout American society during these years. We have already examined how margin lending allowed stock market investors to purchase far more stock than their actual savings could support. But this borrowing culture extended well beyond the stock market itself. Consumer debt, the installment loans that allowed ordinary families to purchase automobiles, radios, and household appliances without paying the full price up front, had also expanded dramatically throughout the decade. Millions of American households were, by the late 1920s, carrying meaningful levels of debt across multiple areas of their financial lives simultaneously, their monthly incomes increasingly stretched thin by payments owed on cars, appliances, and in many cases, stock market margin loans as well. The second warning sign involved the widening gap between how much American consumers were spending and how much they were actually earning. Wages for many ordinary workers throughout the 1920s had grown only modestly, even as the overall American economy expanded rapidly and corporate profits soared to impressive new heights. This meant that a growing share of the consumer spending fueling the decade's celebrated economic boom, the purchases of automobiles and radios and household goods that seemed to demonstrate such widespread and genuine prosperity, was being financed not by rising real income, but by rising debt. Families were in effect spending money they had not yet earned, borrowing against a future that assumed incomes would continue climbing steadily to eventually cover these obligations. The third and perhaps most quietly dangerous warning sign involved industrial overproduction. Throughout the decade, American factories, powered by increasingly sophisticated mass production techniques, had become extraordinarily efficient at manufacturing goods, automobiles, textiles, household appliances, and much else besides. But by the later years of the decade, the productive capacity of American industry had, in a great many sectors, begun to outpace the actual ability or willingness of American consumers to keep purchasing these goods at the same accelerating rate. Warehouses in certain industries were quietly filling with unsold inventory. Agricultural producers, meanwhile, had been struggling with falling crop prices for years already. the result of overproduction on American farms combined with reduced demand from a still recovering, cash-strapped Europe. Farmers across the Midwest and South had, in fact, been experiencing a slow, grinding economic hardship of their own throughout much of the decade, even while the stock market and the glittering cities celebrated an entirely different and far more fortunate economic reality. Taken together, these three warning signs, mounting consumer and speculative debt, spending that had outrun genuine income growth, and industrial production beginning to exceed real demand, painted a picture that was considerably less reassuring than the confident predictions of the permanently high plateau being offered by so many prominent voices at the time. They suggested an economy that had, in important respects, begun to run ahead of itself, sustained increasingly by borrowed money and optimistic assumption rather than by the solid, steady accumulation of genuine underlying wealth. And this brings us to the central investigative question of this chapter, a question that any serious detective examining this case file must eventually confront directly. If these warning signs existed, and the historical evidence makes clear that they did, openly documented at the time by a small number of more cautious economists and financial writers, why did so few people act on them? Why did the buying, the borrowing, and the speculation continue almost entirely unchecked, right up until the very edge of collapse? Part of the answer lies in simple human psychology, in the same fear of missing out we examined in the previous chapter, a powerful emotional force that made caution feel, to millions of ordinary investors, like the far greater risk. Part of the answer lies in the comforting authority of confident experts, men whose academic credentials and professional reputations lent an air of scientific certainty to what was, in reality, an increasingly reckless collective gamble. And part of the answer lies in something even more fundamental and more universally human than either of these explanations. When a great many people are making a great deal of money, and making it easily, few among them wish to be the one who calls a stop to the celebration. Warnings are, by their very nature, unwelcome. They ask people to give up comfortable profits today in exchange for a safety that feels in the moment entirely theoretical and unnecessary. And so throughout the final months of 1929, even as the warning signs accumulated in plain sight for anyone willing to look closely at them, the great machine of American speculation continued to climb, fueled by greed, by borrowed money, and by a collective, almost willful refusal to imagine that the party might ever actually end. It would end. And it would end far sooner and far more violently than almost anyone believed possible. Chapter 4. The First Cracks. A file forgotten before the end of the world. Every great collapse leaves behind a trail of quiet warnings, small cracks in the foundation that appeared long before the walls themselves came down. In the case of 1929, these cracks were not hidden in secret documents or locked away in private ledgers. They were sitting in plain sight, in government reports, in agricultural statistics, in the balance sheets of struggling factories, available to anyone willing to look past the celebration on Wall Street and examine the actual condition of the American economy underneath it. This chapter is, in many ways, the most important piece of evidence in our entire investigation because it answers a question that puzzles almost everyone encountering this story for the first time. If the crash was going to happen, why did almost nobody see it coming? The truth, once you examine the record carefully, is more unsettling than simple ignorance. The warning signs were visible. They were in fact quite serious. The problem was not that the evidence did not exist. The problem was that almost no one wanted to look at it. Let us begin with the part of the American economy that had never truly joined the celebration of the Roaring Twenties in the first place. American agriculture. While the cities glittered with jazz clubs and new automobiles, while stockbrokers celebrated record highs, the American farmer had been living through an entirely different decade, one defined not by prosperity but by a long, grinding financial struggle. During the First World War, American farms had expanded enormously, plowing new land and increasing production dramatically to feed not only the United States but also a Europe whose own farmland had been devastated by years of fighting. Farmers borrowed heavily during these years to purchase more land, more equipment, and more livestock, confident that wartime demand and wartime prices would continue indefinitely. But when the war ended and European agriculture slowly began to recover, that enormous wartime demand for American crops began to fade. American farms, however, continued producing at the same expanded wartime scale, and in many cases increased production even further as new mechanized equipment, like the increasingly common tractor, allowed a single farmer to work far more land than ever before. The result was a painfully simple and painfully predictable economic problem. Supply kept growing while demand shrank, and crop prices, the actual money a farmer received for a bushel of wheat or a bale of cotton, fell steadily throughout most of the decade. By the late 1920s, farm income across enormous stretches of the American Midwest and South had fallen to levels that left many farming families barely able to cover their existing debts, let alone build any kind of meaningful savings. Farm foreclosures, banks seizing land from families who could no longer make their loan payments, had become an increasingly common and increasingly desperate feature of rural American life throughout the decade, years before the crash on Wall Street had even begun. An entire sector of the American economy, one that still employed a very large share of the country's population, had in effect already been living through its own private depression, quietly, out of the headlines, while the rest of the nation celebrated an economic boom that rural Americans were only distantly experiencing, if at all. This agricultural weakness was, in many ways, a preview of a larger problem beginning to take shape across American industry as a whole, and it is here that our investigation turns to the second major crack in the foundation: industrial overproduction. Throughout the 1920s, American factories had achieved staggering improvements in efficiency. New manufacturing techniques, refined assembly line production, and increasingly sophisticated industrial machinery allowed companies to produce far more goods, automobiles, textiles, household appliances, steel, and much else, with far fewer workers and far less time than had been possible only a decade earlier. This was, in one sense, a genuine achievement, a real and lasting improvement in American productive capacity. But productive capacity and consumer demand do not automatically remain in balance with one another. And by the later years of the decade, a troubling gap had begun to open between how much American factories were capable of producing and how much American consumers were actually able or willing to buy. Warehouses in a number of key industries had begun quietly accumulating unsold inventory, goods that had been manufactured in anticipation of continued strong demand, but which were now sitting unpurchased on shelves and in storage yards. Some manufacturers, seeing this growing inventory, had already begun quietly reducing their production schedules well before the stock market crash occurred, scaling back factory output and, in a number of cases, beginning to lay off workers, months before Wall Street's own crisis would make headlines around the world. This slowdown in industrial production connects directly to the third crack in the foundation, a crack that, in retrospect, may be the single most important structural weakness underlying the entire 1920s boom: the growing gap between how much American productivity was increasing and how much ordinary American wages were actually growing. Corporate profits throughout the decade had climbed dramatically, in many cases far outpacing the actual growth in production costs, thanks largely to those same efficiency improvements we have already discussed. But the wages paid to the ordinary workers actually producing these goods had grown at a considerably slower pace, meaning that an increasingly large share of the wealth being generated by the booming American economy was flowing not to the millions of workers and consumers whose spending ultimately powered that economy, but instead to business owners, corporate executives, and wealthy shareholders. The practical consequence of this imbalance was that the very same consumer spending that had fueled the celebrated boom of the Roaring Twenties, the purchases of automobiles, radios, and household appliances that seemed to demonstrate such widespread American prosperity, was becoming increasingly dependent not on rising real wages, but on rising consumer debt. Ordinary families were, in effect, being asked to spend at a level their actual incomes could not comfortably support, a gap they bridged, as we examined in the previous chapter, through the rapidly expanding practice of installment buying. This uneven distribution of the decade's wealth had, by the late 1920s, produced a striking and historically significant divide between rich and poor Americans, a gap in wealth and income that would not be matched again in the United States for many decades afterward. A small percentage of the wealthiest American households controlled a remarkably large share of the nation's total income and total savings, while a much larger share of the population, the very consumers whose ordinary household spending was essential to keeping factories running and stores stocked, possessed comparatively little in the way of real savings or financial cushion. This meant that the entire economic structure of the decade rested on a surprisingly narrow and fragile base. If anything ever interrupted the ability or the willingness of these millions of stretched, indebted households to keep spending and keep borrowing, the consequences for the broader economy could be severe and could arrive with very little advance warning. Into this already fragile situation, one additional and highly significant factor entered the story during the later months of 1929, a factor involving the very institution responsible for overseeing the health of the American financial system itself, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, the United States Central Banking Authority, had watched with growing concern throughout 1928 and into 1929 as stock market speculation, and particularly the explosive growth of margin lending we examined in the previous chapter, continued to accelerate. Some officials within the Federal Reserve System had become genuinely alarmed by what they saw as dangerously excessive borrowing flowing into the stock market. Borrowing that seemed increasingly disconnected from the actual underlying health of the companies whose shares were being purchased. In response to these concerns, the Federal Reserve began, during 1929, to tighten credit conditions across the broader American economy, raising the cost of borrowing money in an effort to slow down what officials increasingly viewed as reckless, runaway speculation. This tightening of credit was intended, at least in part, as a corrective measure, an attempt to cool an overheated market before it grew even more dangerously overextended. But this tightening of credit arrived at a genuinely difficult and delicate moment for the broader American economy, one already weakened by the agricultural struggles, the industrial overproduction, and the widening income gap we have already examined in this chapter. Rather than gently deflating the stock market bubble while leaving the rest of the economy undisturbed, the Federal Reserve's tightening measures placed additional strain on a broader economic system that was, in a great many respects, already more fragile than most observers at the time fully understood or were willing to acknowledge. And this brings us to perhaps the most genuinely puzzling piece of evidence in this entire chapter of our investigation, a fact that any careful detective examining this case must sit with for a long moment before moving forward. Despite all of these visible warning signs, falling farm income, rising industrial inventories, slowing factory production, a dangerously widening gap between wages and productivity, and a central bank actively working to tighten credit conditions across the broader economy, the stock market itself continued climbing to new record-breaking heights throughout much of 1929, right up until the very edge of collapse. Why? Why did a market sitting on top of so many visible economic weaknesses continue rising, seemingly indifferent to every warning sign accumulating beneath it? The honest answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that the stock market of 1929 had, by this point, become substantially disconnected from the broader, real economy it was theoretically supposed to represent. It had become, in important respects, its own separate and self-contained world, driven increasingly by speculation, by borrowed money, and by the collective momentum of millions of investors, all betting essentially on each other's continued confidence, rather than on any careful analysis of underlying economic conditions. As long as new buyers kept arriving, as long as margin loans remained available, as long as the collective belief in ever-rising prices remained strong enough, the market could, for a time, simply outrun the weakening economic reality sitting quietly beneath it. But a structure built this way, resting increasingly on belief and borrowed money rather than genuine underlying value, cannot outrun reality indefinitely. Eventually, something has to give. Eventually, the gap between the soaring confidence on Wall Street and the quietly weakening conditions in farms, factories, and family budgets across the rest of the country becomes too wide to sustain. By the early autumn of 1929, that moment was rapidly approaching. The cracks examined in this chapter, largely ignored, largely dismissed, largely forgotten in the excitement of record-breaking stock prices, were about to converge with a sudden loss of confidence among investors themselves, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential financial collapses in modern history. The file on 1929 had one chapter left to write before the crash itself. It is the chapter our investigation turns to next. Chapter 5. The final days before the fall. Every investigation eventually arrives at the hours just before the crime, the narrow window of time when the pieces that will later seem so obvious in hindsight were still scattered, still ambiguous, still capable of being explained away by anyone determined to keep believing that everything was fine. For the case of 1929, that window opens in the early autumn and it closes violently on a single Tuesday morning that would earn its own permanent place in history. By September of 1929, the stock market had, for the better part of a decade, only ever seemed to move in one direction: up. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reached its historic peak early that month, a record high that capped off years of almost uninterrupted climbing. To the millions of ordinary Americans who had poured their savings, and in many cases their borrowed money, into stocks, this peak did not feel like a warning. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that everything the newspapers, the bankers, and the confident economists had been saying for years was true. America had entered a new era, and that era had no ceiling. But underneath this record high, in rooms far removed from the enthusiastic crowds gathered outside brokerage windows, a different kind of conversation had quietly begun. Throughout the early weeks of September, whispers began circulating among a small circle of professional financiers, seasoned investors, and market analysts, whispers that suggested the market's relentless climb might finally be reaching its natural limit. Some of these whispers were grounded in genuine analysis, the kind of careful arithmetic examined in earlier chapters of this investigation, the widening gap between soaring stock prices and the actual, more modest earnings of the companies behind them. Other whispers were simply the product of nervous instinct, the accumulated unease of experienced traders who had lived through smaller market corrections before, and who sensed, without necessarily being able to articulate exactly why, that this particular climb had gone on for an unusually long time without any meaningful pause. One especially influential voice belonged to a well-known financial analyst who, in a widely circulated market letter published in the middle of September, warned his clients directly that a serious market decline was approaching, that stock prices had climbed to unsustainable levels, and that investors would be wise to begin protecting themselves before it was too late. This warning, when it reached wider public attention, triggered a brief and noticeable wave of selling on Wall Street, a sudden dip in prices that lasted only a few days before the market, still buoyed by years of relentless optimism, began climbing again. Many observers at the time dismissed this brief dip as nothing more than a minor, temporary correction, the kind of small stumble that had occurred periodically throughout the boom without ever signaling anything more serious. But this brief September dip mattered enormously, not because of what it did to prices in the moment, but because of what it revealed about who exactly was beginning to lose confidence. Throughout October, a pattern began to emerge among Wall Street's most sophisticated and well-informed participants, a pattern that would only become fully visible in hindsight once investigators and historians were able to piece together trading records after the fact. A number of the market's largest and most experienced investors, men who had built enormous fortunes over years of careful professional trading and who had access to far more sophisticated financial information than the average department store clerk or taxi driver placing bets with borrowed margin money, began quietly, steadily reducing their own stock holdings throughout the month of October. This selling was not conducted with public announcements or dramatic gestures. It was carried out carefully, methodically, often through trusted brokers instructed to sell gradually in smaller portions, precisely so as not to trigger the kind of panic that a sudden, obvious wave of large-scale selling might cause. These were, after all, sophisticated financial professionals who understood market psychology as well as anyone alive at the time. They understood that if the wider public became aware that some of Wall Street's most successful and most respected investors were quietly heading for the exits, the resulting panic could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, triggering exactly the kind of collapse these same investors were attempting to protect themselves from. Meanwhile, the ordinary public, the millions of clerks and teachers and farmers and housewives who had spent years buying into the promise of endless prosperity, remained, for the most part, remarkably unaware that anything unusual was happening at all. The newspapers of early and mid-October continued largely to reflect the same confident tone that had defined financial journalism throughout the decade. Prominent bankers continued issuing public reassurances. A number of well-known financial figures, when asked directly by journalists about rumors of an approaching downturn, dismissed such talk publicly, insisting that the fundamentals of the American economy remained sound, and that any recent volatility in stock prices represented nothing more than a healthy temporary pause before the market resumed its long-term upward climb. This gap between what a small circle of sophisticated insiders appeared to be quietly doing with their own money and what the wider investing public was being told publicly by trusted authorities would later become one of the most closely examined and most uncomfortable aspects of the entire 1929 story. It raised questions that investigators, historians, and eventually government regulators would spend years attempting to answer. Had a meaningful number of Wall Street's most powerful and most well-connected figures recognized the coming danger well before the general public did, and quietly protected themselves while continuing to project public confidence that encouraged millions of ordinary Americans to keep buying right up until the very edge of collapse? This question does not have a single simple answer, and reasonable historians examining the same historical record have reached somewhat different conclusions about exactly how much foreknowledge existed and exactly how deliberately it may have been concealed from the wider public. But the basic pattern, quiet, methodical selling among some of the market's most sophisticated participants during October, occurring alongside continued public reassurance from many of the same financial institutions and prominent figures, remains one of the case file's most significant and most debated pieces of evidence. As October progressed, the warning signs became increasingly difficult to entirely hide, even from ordinary investors who were not paying particularly close attention to Wall Street's inner workings. Anyone watching the stock ticker, the mechanical device in brokerage house windows across the country that printed a continuous ribbon of paper listing the latest trading prices, would have noticed something increasingly strange throughout the middle weeks of October. Trading volume, the sheer number of shares changing hands each day, began climbing to levels that were, by the standards of the time, genuinely unusual. And alongside this rising volume, prices themselves began swinging with a violence that had rarely been seen before. A stock might climb sharply in the morning, only to plunge dramatically by the afternoon, then partially recover before the closing bell, leaving even experienced traders struggling to understand exactly what direction the market was actually moving in. This kind of extreme volatility, wild, unpredictable swings occurring alongside unusually heavy trading volume, is recognized by financial analysts both in 1929 and in the modern era as one of the clearest possible signals that a market has become deeply unstable, a signal that confidence among investors has begun to fracture, even if prices have not yet begun a sustained obvious decline. It is the financial equivalent of a fever spiking just before an illness becomes fully visible, a warning written directly into the market's own behavior for anyone paying close enough attention to read it. Certain individual trading days throughout the middle and later part of October stood out, even at the time, as particularly alarming. On several occasions, the market opened with a sudden, sharp decline, only to be followed by a dramatic last-minute rally in the final hour of trading. a rally that a number of financial historians would later attribute, at least in part, to coordinated buying by a small group of extremely powerful bankers, men who gathered informally to pool their own resources and purchase large quantities of stock specifically in order to prevent a full-scale panic from taking hold. These interventions, while never officially organized or publicly announced as such, appeared to succeed, at least temporarily, in each instance, restoring a fragile sense of calm to the market for a few more days at a time. But each of these temporary rescues bought only a brief reprieve, and with each subsequent alarming trading day, the underlying nervousness running through Wall Street continued to build, even as the wider public, still largely trusting the reassuring headlines in their morning newspapers, remained largely unaware of just how fragile the situation inside the exchange had actually become. This brings our investigation to one of the most important and most difficult questions in the entire case file. Who exactly sold first? In the strictest, most literal sense, this is a question that can never be answered with complete certainty. Millions of individual investors, brokers, and institutions were making their own independent decisions throughout these final weeks, and no single ledger exists that could definitively identify one solitary individual as the very first domino to fall. But in a broader, more meaningful sense, the historical record does allow investigators to identify a general pattern, and that pattern points with reasonable consistency toward the market's most sophisticated and most well-informed participants. It was not, in other words, the shoeshine boys or the department store clerks or the school teachers who first recognized the danger and began quietly protecting themselves. It was the professionals, the men whose entire careers were built around understanding exactly how fragile a market built on borrowed money and inflated expectation could ultimately become. These were the men with access to the earliest, clearest signals, the men whose trading decisions throughout October set in motion a slow, quiet drift toward the exits, a drift that the ordinary investing public, still trusting the confident headlines above them, would not fully recognize until it was very nearly too late. By the final days of October, this quiet drift was about to become something else entirely. The careful, methodical selling of October's early weeks was about to give way to something far more sudden, far more visible, and far more devastating. The fever that had been building quietly beneath the surface of Wall Street throughout the entire month was, within days, about to break completely into the open. What began as a whisper among a small circle of sophisticated investors was about to become a scream heard around the entire world. Chapter 6: Black Thursday, when the panic finally began. The morning of the 24th of October, 1929, began like so many other autumn mornings on Wall Street. Brokers arrived early, newspapers were read over hurried breakfasts, and the streets outside the New York Stock Exchange filled with the familiar rhythm of a financial district getting ready for another day of trading. Nothing about the sky that morning, nothing about the temperature or the traffic or the ordinary sounds of the city gave any outward sign that this particular Thursday would be remembered for the rest of the century and beyond as the day panic finally arrived on Wall Street. But inside the exchange, the tension that had been quietly building throughout the preceding weeks was about to break, suddenly and violently, into the open. Trading opened that morning under conditions that were, from the very first minutes, noticeably unsettled. Prices, which had already been swinging with unusual volatility throughout October, began drifting downward almost immediately. At first, this decline looked much like the smaller dips that had occurred periodically throughout the month, the kind of temporary stumble that had, on previous occasions, been followed by a recovery within a day or two. But this time, the selling did not pause. It accelerated. Word began spreading through the exchange, floor to floor, broker to broker, that large blocks of stock were being sold in quantities far beyond what anyone had anticipated. As more investors became aware that heavy selling was underway, a psychological shift began to take hold, one that any investigator studying financial panics recognizes as a critical turning point. Investors who might otherwise have held on to their shares, waiting patiently for prices to recover as they so often had before, began instead to fear that if they did not sell immediately, they would be forced to sell later at an even worse price. This fear, spreading rapidly from trader to trader, transformed what had begun as ordinary selling into something far more dangerous: a stampede. By the middle of the morning, the volume of shares being traded had reached levels that the exchange's own mechanical systems struggled to keep pace with. The stock ticker, the narrow ribbon of paper that printed each trade as it occurred, fell further and further behind the actual pace of trading on the floor below. Brokers and investors reading the ticker throughout the day were, in a very real sense, watching yesterday's prices scroll past them, unaware of just how much further the market had already fallen in the minutes since those trades had actually occurred. This delay, this widening gap between the printed ticker and the true real-time state of the market, added an entirely new layer of confusion and fear to an already chaotic situation. Nobody, not even the most experienced professionals on the exchange floor, could say with any real confidence exactly how bad the damage had become at any given moment. By the time the closing bell rang that afternoon, an almost unimaginable volume of shares had changed hands. A record-breaking number of individual stock transactions completed within a single trading day, a record that would stand for years afterward. Estimates from the time suggest that something in the range of 13 million shares were traded that day alone, an amount so far beyond the exchange's normal daily volume that the entire financial infrastructure of Wall Street, the tickers, the telephone lines, the small army of clerks responsible for recording each transaction had been pushed to its absolute limit. Outside the exchange, on the street itself, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. As word of the collapsing prices spread beyond the walls of the trading floor, a crowd began to gather outside the exchange building, drawn by rumor, by fear, and by a simple, desperate desire to understand what was actually happening to their money. Police officers were called to help manage the growing crowd, not because of any violence, but simply because of its size and because of the palpable, anxious energy running through it. Men who had spent years reading about Wall Street's triumphs in the newspaper now stood outside its doors in person, watching, waiting, hoping for any scrap of information about whether their savings, their borrowed margin investments, their entire financial futures still existed in any meaningful form. It was into this atmosphere of mounting panic that one of the most significant and most closely studied interventions in American financial history took place. In the early afternoon, as the market's decline showed no sign of slowing on its own, a small group of the country's most powerful bankers made a decision that would become legendary in the history of Wall Street. Representatives from several of the largest and most influential banking institutions in New York quietly gathered for an emergency meeting, and from that meeting emerged a coordinated plan of action. These bankers agreed to pool a significant sum of their own money and the money of the institutions they represented in order to purchase large quantities of stock directly in a deliberate public effort to halt the panic and restore confidence before the closing bell. One senior banking executive, acting as a representative for this group, walked out onto the floor of the exchange itself that afternoon and began placing highly visible, large-scale buy orders for shares of several major, well-known companies, purchasing stock at prices noticeably above where the market had already fallen to. This gesture was designed to send a clear and powerful signal, both to the other traders on the floor and to the anxious public outside, that some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in American finance believed the market's recent decline had gone too far, too fast, and that they were willing to put their own substantial fortunes behind that belief. The effect of this intervention was immediate and, at least in the short term, remarkably successful. Word of the coordinated buying spread quickly through the exchange, and the panic that had gripped the trading floor throughout the morning and early afternoon began to visibly ease. Selling slowed. In some cases, prices even began to recover modestly before the end of the day. By the time trading closed that Thursday afternoon, the market, while still down noticeably from where it had opened, had pulled back from the far more severe losses recorded at the worst point of the day's chaos. To exhausted traders and anxious investors alike, this late-day recovery felt in the moment like genuine relief. Perhaps many hoped the worst had already passed. That evening, newspapers and financial commentators worked quickly to reassure the public. Prominent bankers and government officials issued public statements emphasizing that the underlying condition of the American economy remained fundamentally sound, that the day's dramatic events represented a temporary, technical correction rather than any deeper crisis, and that the coordinated action taken by the country's leading financial institutions demonstrated exactly the kind of responsible stewardship that would prevent any further serious trouble. For a brief moment, this reassurance seemed to work. The following trading day, Friday, and the half day of trading on Saturday saw prices stabilize and in some cases recover further, lending genuine credibility to the hope that the crisis of Black Thursday, as that terrible day would soon come to be known, had been successfully contained. But beneath this fragile calm, a far more uncomfortable question was quietly taking shape, a question that any careful investigator examining this case file must confront directly, even though the full, devastating answer would not become clear for a few more days. Had the intervention of the country's most powerful bankers genuinely solved the underlying problem that had caused Black Thursday's panic in the first place? Or had it simply delayed temporarily an outcome that had already become unavoidable? To answer this question honestly requires looking back at everything examined in the earlier chapters of this investigation. The market's collapse on Black Thursday had not emerged from nowhere. It was the direct, almost inevitable consequence of years of speculation built on borrowed money, of stock prices that had climbed far beyond the actual earnings of the companies behind them, of an increasingly fragile real economy weakened by struggling farms, overproducing factories, and a dangerously widening gap between the nation's wealthiest citizens and everyone else. The coordinated buying by a small group of powerful bankers on the afternoon of the 24th of October had addressed none of these deeper structural problems. It had, in the most literal sense, simply purchased time, using a relatively modest amount of money to temporarily absorb an overwhelming wave of panicked selling in the hope that confidence, once restored, might hold long enough for the underlying pressures driving that selling to somehow ease on their own. This is, in many respects, the essential nature of every financial rescue of this kind, whether in 1929 or in the many similar interventions that would follow in the decades afterward. A rescue of this type can successfully calm a panic. It can restore, for a time, the fragile psychological confidence that any speculative market ultimately depends upon. But it cannot, by itself, repair the deeper structural weaknesses that caused the panic to begin with. If those weaknesses remain unaddressed, if the underlying imbalance between speculative price and genuine economic value remains as wide as it was before, then a rescue of this kind functions not as a genuine cure, but as a temporary bandage stretched tightly over a wound that continues quietly to worsen underneath it. As the weekend following Black Thursday came to a close, the American public, and much of Wall Street itself, allowed themselves to believe that the worst had passed. The market had stumbled badly, certainly, but the swift, decisive action of the country's leading bankers appeared to have prevented a genuine catastrophe. Newspapers on Monday morning struck a cautiously optimistic tone, praising the resilience of the American financial system and the responsible leadership demonstrated during Thursday's crisis. But the case file on 1929 was far from closed. The underlying pressures that had produced Black Thursday's panic in the first place, the speculative debt, the inflated prices, the fragile real economy hidden beneath years of borrowed optimism, remained exactly as dangerous as they had been the week before. The rescue had bought Wall Street a few more days of fragile calm. It had not bought a solution. And within that narrow window of borrowed time, the true collapse was already quietly gathering its final and most devastating momentum. Chapter 7. Black Tuesday, the moment all of America fell into the abyss. If Black Thursday was the tremor, Black Tuesday was the earthquake itself. The day the fragile calm purchased so carefully by a handful of powerful bankers finally, completely, and irreversibly gave way. The 29th of October, 1929, began with an unmistakable sense of dread already hanging over Wall Street, even before the opening bell rang. The optimism of the previous Friday and Saturday, the cautious hope that the country's leading financiers had successfully contained the crisis of Black Thursday, had not survived the weekend intact. Over Sunday and Monday, reports had continued to circulate of investors receiving urgent notices from their brokers, demands for additional cash to cover margin loans that had fallen dangerously close to being wiped out entirely by the previous week's losses. These notices, known as margin calls, were arriving by telephone, by telegram, and by messenger throughout the weekend and into Monday. And for a great many investors who did not have additional cash readily available, there was only one possible response: sell. By the time trading opened on Tuesday morning, this wave of forced selling, investors liquidating shares not because they had chosen to, but because they had no other way to meet the demands of their brokers, had already begun building into something far larger and far more dangerous than anything Wall Street had experienced the previous week. From the very first minute of trading, it became clear that this day would be unlike any other in the history of the exchange. Sell orders poured onto the floor in overwhelming, almost unimaginable numbers. Brokers who had, only days earlier, been struggling to keep pace with heavy trading volume now found themselves facing something closer to a complete flood, an avalanche of orders arriving faster than any human being or any mechanical system could possibly process. And this time, there was a critical difference from the previous Thursday's panic, a difference that would determine, more than any other single factor, just how catastrophic this particular day would become. There were no buyers. On Black Thursday, even amid the chaos, a meaningful number of investors, and eventually the coordinated intervention of the country's leading banks, had been willing to step in and purchase shares at falling prices, believing, correctly or not, that the decline represented a temporary overreaction that would soon reverse. On Black Tuesday, that belief had, for an overwhelming majority of market participants, simply evaporated. Confidence, the single invisible ingredient that had sustained the entire speculative boom of the previous decade, had finally completely broken. Almost nobody wanted to buy. Everybody, it seemed, wanted only to sell as quickly as possible at whatever price they could get before prices fell even further. This absence of buyers created a uniquely brutal dynamic. In an ordinary market, even a falling one, some natural floor tends to emerge, a price low enough that new buyers, sensing an opportunity, begin stepping in to purchase shares, which in turn helps slow or stabilize the decline. On Black Tuesday, this natural floor essentially disappeared. Stock prices did not simply fall. They collapsed, in some cases losing enormous portions of their value within a matter of hours, with no meaningful buying pressure anywhere in sight to slow the descent. The numbers recorded that day remain, even nearly a century later, almost difficult to comprehend. Something in the range of 16 million shares changed hands over the course of the trading session, shattering the record that had only just been set the previous Thursday. The total value wiped out from the American stock market that single day has been estimated by historians and economists at somewhere in the range of many billions of dollars, an amount that, when adjusted for the value of money at the time, represented a staggering portion of the entire nation's accumulated wealth, gone within the span of a single trading day. Once again, the mechanical stock ticker, the device that had struggled to keep pace with trading volume the previous week, fell catastrophically behind the actual pace of transactions on the floor. By the middle of the afternoon, the ticker was running so far behind real-time trading that the prices it printed bore almost no meaningful relationship to what stocks were actually selling for in that exact moment. Investors and brokers across the country, reading these delayed figures in brokerage house windows from New York to Chicago to San Francisco, were, in a very real and very cruel sense, watching a version of the crash that was already significantly out of date, unaware of just how much further prices had already fallen in the minutes since those numbers had been printed. Some reports suggest the ticker did not finish printing the full record of that day's trading until well after midnight, hours after the exchange itself had physically closed its doors. Inside brokerage offices across the country, the atmosphere had shifted from anxious concern to something closer to complete paralysis. Telephone lines, already stretched to their absolute limit the previous week, became so overwhelmed with call volume that many brokers found themselves entirely unable to reach the exchange floor at all, leaving them helpless to execute the desperate sell orders being shouted at them by panicked clients standing directly in front of their desks. Clerks who had, only weeks earlier, been processing routine paperwork tied to a booming celebratory market now found themselves buried under mountains of urgent, chaotic transactions, many of which could not be properly completed or recorded for days, and in some cases, weeks afterward. The entire physical and administrative machinery supporting the American stock market, a system that had never been designed to handle anything remotely close to this volume or this level of panic, had, for all practical purposes, ground to a near standstill. For the individual investors caught inside this collapse, the human consequences were immediate, and in an enormous number of cases, absolutely devastating. Consider what had happened, in purely financial terms, to a great many of the ordinary Americans described earlier in this investigation, the clerks, teachers, taxi drivers, and small business owners who had spent the previous several years buying stock, often using borrowed margin money to amplify their purchases far beyond what their actual savings could support. For these investors, the collapse of Black Tuesday did not simply mean a disappointing decline in the value of their savings. It meant something far more severe. Because so much of their stock had been purchased using borrowed money, a large portion of these investors found themselves not merely poorer, but in genuine, sometimes crushing debt, owing their brokers sums of money that, in many cases, they had absolutely no way of repaying. Their original investment, the modest cash cushion they had put down to open their margin accounts, had been completely wiped out, and in a great many cases, they now owed additional money on top of that original loss. The human stories emerging from this collapse, recorded in newspaper accounts, personal letters, and later historical interviews, paint a portrait of genuine, widespread devastation that extended far beyond the trading floor itself and into ordinary households across the entire country. Families who had spent years building what felt like a genuinely secure financial future found that future erased within the span of a single week. Fathers who had proudly told their children about the steady, growing value of their investment accounts now faced the far more painful task of explaining that those accounts, and in many cases, significant additional debt alongside them, meant the family home, the children's education savings, or a comfortable retirement long planned for, were now in serious jeopardy. Marriages that had already been under strain from other pressures buckled further under the weight of sudden, unexpected financial ruin, as couples found themselves forced to confront debts and losses neither partner had fully understood the risks of at the time they were incurred. Small businesses, many of which had either invested company funds directly in the booming stock market or had extended their own credit and inventory purchases based on the assumption of continued general prosperity, found themselves suddenly unable to meet their own obligations. A shopkeeper who had confidently expanded his store the previous year, borrowing against the rising value of his personal stock portfolio to finance new inventory, now faced demands from his own creditors at precisely the moment his primary source of collateral had collapsed to a fraction of its former value. Across countless communities, this same basic pattern repeated itself. Businesses that had seemed only weeks earlier to be thriving examples of the decade's prosperity, suddenly teetering on the edge of their own collapse, dragged down by financial arrangements that had quietly depended, in ways their owners had not always fully appreciated, on the continued rise of a stock market that had just violently reversed course. Perhaps most significantly, Black Tuesday represented, for millions of ordinary Americans, something that extended well beyond any single financial loss, however severe. It represented the sudden, brutal collapse of an entire way of thinking about the future, a belief system that had defined an entire decade of American life. The promise at the heart of the Roaring Twenties, examined closely throughout the earlier chapters of this investigation, had been a promise of permanent, ever-expanding prosperity, a belief that hard work, modest savings, and a willingness to participate in the exciting new world of stock market investing could reliably deliver a better, more comfortable future for anyone willing to take part. Black Tuesday did not simply erase paper wealth. It shattered this underlying promise, this deeply held faith in a permanently rising American future, leaving millions of citizens to confront a far more uncertain and far more frightening version of their country's economic reality. This brings our investigation to the central defining question of this entire chapter, a question that separates Black Tuesday from the smaller, more survivable panic of the previous Thursday. Why, this time, could nothing be done to stop it? The previous week, a coordinated intervention by a small group of powerful bankers had successfully calmed the market, at least temporarily, by demonstrating visible, large-scale confidence through direct purchases of stock. On Black Tuesday, this same strategy was in fact attempted again, but its effect this time was dramatically, tragically smaller. The fundamental problem was one of sheer scale. The selling pressure unleashed on Black Tuesday, driven by a nationwide wave of desperate, forced liquidation as countless margin accounts collapsed simultaneously across the entire country, was simply too large, too widespread, and too deeply rooted in genuine financial desperation for any group of private individuals, however wealthy, to meaningfully absorb. The previous week's rescue had worked because it addressed a crisis that was still fundamentally a crisis of confidence, a psychological panic that visible reassurance could genuinely calm. Black Tuesday's collapse was no longer merely psychological. It had become a crisis of genuine mathematical insolvency. Millions of individual investors who quite literally no longer possessed the money required to meet their obligations, regardless of how much confidence anyone tried to project onto the market around them. No amount of reassurance, no coordinated show of confidence from even the wealthiest bankers in the country could manufacture money that simply did not exist. The speculative structure examined throughout this entire investigation, built for years on borrowed money resting upon borrowed money, resting in turn upon a widening, dangerous gap between soaring stock prices and the genuine underlying value of the companies those prices supposedly represented, had finally completely collapsed under its own accumulated weight. There was no rescue large enough and no confidence powerful enough to hold it up any longer. The American stock market would continue falling in fits and starts for weeks and months to come, but the 29th of October, 1929, Black Tuesday, would forever remain the day the great illusion of the Roaring Twenties finally, completely and irreversibly came to an end. What remained in the aftermath of that single devastating day was an entire nation left to confront the question our investigation turns to next. What happens to a country and to the millions of individual lives within it once the dream that defined an entire decade has been so thoroughly, so publicly, and so painfully proven false? Chapter 8. The Jumps from Wall Street's Towers. Truth and Legend. Few images from the crash of 1929 have embedded themselves as deeply into popular imagination as the picture of ruined investors climbing to the ledges of Wall Street's tallest buildings and jumping to their deaths, one after another, in the panicked days surrounding Black Tuesday. It is a picture that has appeared in countless books, films, and popular retellings of the crash, so consistently repeated that many people today accept it as simple, established historical fact. This chapter exists to examine that picture carefully, to separate what the historical evidence actually supports from what has, over nearly a century, quietly grown into legend. Let us begin with where this story actually came from. In the days immediately surrounding the crash, a number of jokes and offhand remarks began circulating among journalists, comedians, and ordinary New Yorkers, dark humor of the kind that often emerges spontaneously during moments of genuine collective anxiety. One widely repeated line, often attributed to a popular humorist of the era, suggested that hotel clerks in New York had begun asking arriving guests whether they wanted a room for sleeping or for jumping, a grim joke reflecting the widespread, if largely exaggerated, public assumption that suicide had become a common response to sudden financial ruin. This kind of gallows humor, born from genuine anxiety and repeated widely at the time, would later prove to be one of the most important sources feeding the legend that grew up around the crash. Newspapers of the era, competing fiercely for readers in an intensely crowded market, also played a significant role in shaping this narrative. A financial collapse of this scale was, without question, one of the most dramatic news stories of the century, and editors understood that stories involving personal tragedy tended to capture public attention far more powerfully than dry statistical reporting on falling stock prices. When isolated incidents involving financiers or investors did occur, they often received prominent front page coverage, sometimes accompanied by dramatic language that emphasized their connection to the crash, even in cases where the full circumstances behind an individual tragedy were considerably more complicated than a single headline could capture. So, what does the actual historical evidence show? Careful research conducted by historians and economists in the decades since 1929, examining official mortality records from New York City and the broader United States during this period, has produced a picture considerably more nuanced than the popular legend suggests. The most frequently cited and most thorough of these investigations, drawing on official city records, found no dramatic immediate spike in suicides, occurring specifically within the days surrounding Black Thursday and Black Tuesday themselves. In other words, the popular image of crowds of ruined investors leaping from windows in the immediate, chaotic hours of the crash itself does not appear to be well supported by the surviving historical record. This does not mean that the broader crisis had no connection whatsoever to genuine human tragedy. Suicide rates across the United States, and specifically within New York City, did show a measurable increase over the following months and years, as the initial stock market crash gradually widened into the far longer, far more devastating economic depression that would grip the entire country throughout the following decade. This increase, however, unfolded gradually, tracking the slow, grinding rise of unemployment, business failures, and lost savings across the broader economy, rather than occurring as a sudden dramatic wave in the immediate aftermath of the crash's most famous days. The genuine human toll of this period was real, and it was significant, but it followed a pattern closer to a slow, sustained tide than to the single dramatic wave depicted in popular legend. There were, without question, a small number of individual cases in which prominent financiers or investors did take their own lives in connection with catastrophic losses tied to the crash, both in the immediate aftermath of October 1929 and during the difficult years that followed. These cases were genuine, and they were genuinely tragic, and it would be inaccurate and disrespectful to those individuals and their families to suggest that no such tragedies occurred at all. But the historical evidence indicates that these individual cases, however sobering, were considerably fewer in number and considerably more spread out over time than the popular image of a mass wave of jumping investor would suggest. This raises an important question for our investigation. If the historical evidence does not fully support the dramatic popular legend, why has this particular image of investors leaping from Wall Street endured so powerfully for so many decades in the public imagination? Several factors appear to have contributed to this remarkable staying power. The first is simply the emotional force of the image itself. A story involving sudden, dramatic personal tragedy connects with human audiences on a far deeper emotional level than a story involving abstract financial statistics, however severe those statistics might genuinely be. The crash of 1929 destroyed an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth, but a raw number, however large, does not naturally translate into a vivid, memorable image in the way that a single dramatic human story does. The jumping investor became, in effect, a kind of symbolic shorthand, a single visceral image capable of representing an entire, otherwise abstract economic catastrophe in a way ordinary people could instantly grasp and remember. The second factor involves the way stories of this kind naturally spread and transform through repeated retelling, a pattern familiar to historians studying the evolution of popular legend across many different eras and cultures. Each time this particular story was repeated in a newspaper article, a later history book, a popular film, or simply a conversation between neighbors, there existed a natural tendency for the details to grow slightly more dramatic, slightly more vivid, slightly more certain than the original, more limited evidence actually supported. A single, genuinely documented tragedy mentioned briefly in a period newspaper could, over decades of retelling, gradually transform in the popular imagination into a suggestion of dozens, then eventually hundreds of similar cases, even though the underlying historical evidence never actually grew to support such an expanded claim. The third factor, and perhaps the most psychologically significant, involves what this particular image allows audiences to understand about the genuine human experience of catastrophic financial loss, even when the literal physical details of the popular legend are exaggerated. Consider for a moment the genuine psychological experience of the investors examined throughout this entire investigation, the clerks, teachers, small business owners, and financiers who had built their sense of financial security, and in many cases, their entire sense of personal identity and self-worth around the steadily rising value of their stock portfolios throughout the previous decade. For a great many of these individuals, the crash of 1929 did not represent merely the loss of money. It represented the sudden, complete collapse of an entire imagined future, a future many had spent years planning around, promising themselves and their families, and building their sense of personal accomplishment upon. This kind of loss, the loss of an entire imagined future, rather than simply a numerical sum, produces a genuinely profound and genuinely devastating psychological experience, one that modern research into financial trauma and sudden loss continues to study closely even today. The image of a man leaping from a tall building, however exaggerated its actual historical frequency may have been, captures something emotionally true about this deeper experience, even where it fails as a literal, statistical account of what actually happened during those specific days in October. It represents, symbolically, the sensation of an entire world, an entire sense of identity and security, collapsing so suddenly and so completely that no other outcome seemed conceivable to the person experiencing it. This is perhaps the deepest reason this particular legend has endured so powerfully across nearly a century, not because it was literally statistically accurate, but because it captured in a single unforgettable image an emotional truth about catastrophic loss that resonated far more powerfully than any dry economic statistic ever could. So where does this leave our investigation as we close this particular chapter of the case file? The evidence supports the following conclusion: one that respects both historical accuracy and the genuine human suffering that unquestionably occurred during this period. The literal popular legend of Wall Street's towers lined with jumping investors in the immediate chaos of Black Thursday and Black Tuesday themselves is not well supported by the surviving historical record and appears to have grown considerably beyond its actual factual foundation through decades of dramatic retelling, newspaper sensationalism, and dark humor that gradually hardened in the public imagination into accepted fact. At the same time, the underlying human tragedy the legend points toward was genuinely real. Financial ruin on this scale did, in a measurable and well-documented way, contribute to rising rates of genuine personal despair and tragedy across American society, unfolding gradually over the months and years following the crash, rather than in the single dramatic wave depicted in popular legend. The crash of 1929 destroyed far more than paper wealth. It destroyed, for millions of Americans, an entire imagined future, and the genuine psychological toll of that destruction, however it have been exaggerated or distorted in specific popular retellings, remains one of the most sobering and most important human dimensions of this entire historical case file. This is, in the end, the honest conclusion our investigation must reach. Separate the myth from the fact, and what remains is not a less serious story, but a more truthful one. A story of genuine, widespread human suffering that did not require dramatic exaggeration to be understood as one of the great tragedies of modern economic history. This chapter, and the broader investigation it belongs to, touches on real human loss, including the topic of suicide during a period of severe financial hardship. If you or someone you know is struggling with difficult thoughts or emotions, please consider reaching out to a mental health professional or a local crisis support service in your area. Chapter 9. The Great Depression begins. When all of America sank into darkness, the stock market crash of October 1929, when the strictest technical sense, a financial event, a collapse in the price of paper assets traded on a single exchange in Lower Manhattan. But what followed in the months and years afterward was something far larger, far darker, and far more devastating than any single market collapse could, on its own, ever fully explain. What followed was the transformation of a financial panic into a genuine, sustained, nationwide catastrophe, one that would come to be known simply as the Great Depression, a period of hardship so severe and so prolonged that it would reshape American society for an entire generation. To understand how a stock market crash, however severe, became something as vast and as devastating as the Great Depression, our investigation must follow the chain of consequences outward from Wall Street into the banking system, into American businesses, and finally into the daily lives of ordinary families across the entire country. The first link in this chain involves the American banking system itself, an institution that, as we examined earlier in this investigation, had become far more entangled with stock market speculation than most depositors ever realized. In the aftermath of the crash, as stock values continued falling and countless margin loans collapsed into worthless debt, a great many banks found themselves holding assets, whether stocks purchased directly or loans secured against now worthless collateral that had lost a devastating portion of their value almost overnight. This alone would have been a serious problem, but it quickly combined with a second, equally dangerous force: fear. As news of bank failures began to spread, first in scattered local reports, then increasingly across the national press, ordinary depositors across the country began to grow anxious about the safety of their own savings. In an era before deposit insurance existed, to guarantee that an individual's savings would be protected even if their bank failed, this anxiety carried genuine, immediate financial danger. If a depositor believed his bank might fail, his rational response, however damaging to the broader system, was to withdraw his money immediately before the bank collapsed and that money was lost entirely. This individually rational behavior, multiplied across millions of anxious depositors simultaneously, produced what economists and historians refer to as a bank run, a self-reinforcing wave of withdrawals capable of destroying even a fundamentally sound financial institution. Banks, by their very nature, do not keep the full sum of their depositors' money sitting idle in a vault. They lend a significant portion of it out to businesses, to homeowners, to farmers, earning interest that allows the bank itself to operate and to pay depositors a modest return on their own savings. When a large number of depositors demand their money back simultaneously, a bank can quickly find itself unable to produce the necessary cash, even if its underlying loans and investments remain fundamentally sound over the longer term. The bank is forced to close its doors, and depositors who did not withdraw their money in time can lose their savings entirely. Throughout 1930 and into the following years, this pattern repeated itself across thousands of individual communities throughout the United States. A rumor, sometimes accurate, sometimes entirely false, would begin circulating that a particular local bank was in trouble. Anxious depositors would form lines outside the bank's doors, each one determined to withdraw their savings before it was too late. In many cases, this very panic, this very rush to withdraw money became the direct cause of the bank's collapse, transforming a rumor into a devastating, self-fulfilling reality. Over the course of the Depression's early years, several thousand American banks failed entirely, wiping out the savings of untold millions of ordinary families who had trusted these institutions with the modest financial security they had spent years, sometimes entire lifetimes, carefully building. This wave of bank failures produced what historians and economists studying this period frequently describe as a domino effect, a chain reaction in which the collapse of one part of the economic system triggered further collapse in the parts connected to it, which in turn triggered still further collapse beyond that. Consider how this chain reaction unfolded in practice. As banks failed or grew increasingly cautious in the face of widespread panic, they dramatically reduced the amount of new lending they were willing to extend to businesses and individuals. Businesses that had previously relied on bank loans to purchase raw materials, to pay their workers during slower seasons, or to finance expansion and new equipment suddenly found this essential credit unavailable, even for companies whose underlying operations remained genuinely sound. Without access to credit and facing collapsing consumer demand as anxious, cash-strapped, cash-strapped American households sharply reduced their own spending, businesses across the entire country began cutting costs in the only way immediately available to them, reducing their workforce. This produced the next devastating link in the chain. Unemployment, which had remained relatively modest throughout the prosperous years of the 1920s, began climbing at a pace that shocked even experienced economists. Factory after factory reduced production or closed entirely. Construction projects, dependent on financing that had largely evaporated, ground to a halt across the country. Small businesses, from local shops to regional manufacturers, closed their doors in overwhelming numbers, unable to survive the combination of collapsing demand and vanishing credit. By the depths of the Depression, in the early 1930s, unemployment across the United States had climbed to levels never before experienced in the nation's history, with roughly 1 out of every 4 American workers unable to find any job at all, a figure that, even when described in the driest statistical terms, represents an almost unimaginable scale of human hardship spread across millions of individual households. And it is here, in the daily, lived experience of ordinary American families, that the true human cost of the Great Depression becomes most visible and most difficult to fully convey through statistics alone. Across the country, in cities both large and small, one particular image came to symbolize the Depression's grinding hardship more powerfully than perhaps any other. Long lines of men, and increasingly women and children as well, standing patiently for hours outside charitable organizations and makeshift relief kitchens, waiting for a simple, free meal, often little more than bread and soup, provided by churches, charities, and eventually municipal governments, struggling to respond to a scale of need that had never before been imagined necessary in the modern United States. These breadlines, as they came to be known, stretched for entire city blocks in some of the hardest hit urban areas, filled not with the chronically destitute the public might once have associated with such charity, but increasingly with former factory workers, former office clerks, former small business owners, ordinary Americans who only a few short years earlier had confidently believed themselves to be permanently secure members of a prosperous, modern middle class. Behind these public images of bread lines lay countless private tragedies, unfolding quietly within individual households across the entire country. Families who had purchased homes during the prosperous years of the previous decade, often financed through mortgages that assumed continued steady income, found themselves unable to keep up with monthly payments as job losses and wage cuts spread across the economy. Foreclosures, banks, or other lenders seizing homes from families who could no longer make their payments became an increasingly common and increasingly devastating feature of American life throughout the early 1930s, displacing families who had believed homeownership represented the very foundation of the secure American future the previous decade had promised them. Children across the country experienced this crisis in ways that would shape their entire understanding of economic security for the rest of their lives. Many families, unable to afford even the modest costs associated with schooling, clothing, and supplies, were forced to withdraw their children from school entirely, sending them instead to search for whatever paid work, however meager, they might be able to find in order to help support a struggling household. Malnutrition, a genuine and widespread concern throughout many of the hardest hit communities during this period, affected a significant number of American children, a sobering reminder of just how far the nation's material circumstances had fallen from the confident prosperity celebrated so enthusiastically only a few years earlier. Homelessness, too, became a far more visible and far more widespread feature of American life than it had been at any point in recent memory. Families who lost their homes to foreclosure, and individuals who lost both their jobs and their ability to afford even modest rent increasingly found themselves without any permanent shelter at all. Improvised shantytowns, informal settlements built from scrap wood, cardboard, and whatever other materials could be scavenged, sprang up on the outskirts of major American cities, providing crude, precarious shelter to families who had, only a few years earlier, considered themselves comfortably established members of the growing American middle class. These settlements, which acquired the bitterly ironic nickname referencing the sitting president at the time, stood as visible physical monuments to just how completely the promises of the previous decade had collapsed. This brings our investigation to perhaps the single most important remaining question in this chapter of the case file. Why did this crisis, unlike previous economic downturns in American history, persist for so many years, rather than resolving itself relatively quickly, as earlier recessions generally had? Several interlocking factors, many of which our investigation has already examined in earlier chapters, combined to produce this unusually prolonged and unusually severe downturn. The collapse of the banking system, examined earlier in this chapter, destroyed not only individual savings, but also the essential flow of credit that any modern economy depends upon to function. And rebuilding public trust in the banking system, once shattered so completely and so publicly, proved to be an extraordinarily slow and difficult process. The severe reduction in consumer spending, as millions of newly unemployed or newly cautious American households dramatically cut back their purchases, created a self-reinforcing downward spiral, in which reduced spending led to further business closures and further layoffs, which in turn led to still further reductions in spending across the broader economy. International factors, including the collapse of global trade as other nations, struggling with their own economic difficulties, increasingly raised trade barriers and tariffs, further deepened and prolonged the crisis, transforming what had begun as a distinctly American financial panic into a genuinely global economic catastrophe. And government policy during the earliest years of the crisis, shaped by the prevailing economic thinking of the time, often prioritized balanced budgets and limited government intervention, approaches that a great many economists studying this period have since concluded likely worsened and prolonged the depression rather than resolving it, particularly before more active government intervention began later in the decade. Taken together, these interlocking factors transformed what began as a stock market crash, confined largely to Wall Street, into a sustained nationwide catastrophe that would grip the United States and much of the wider world for the better part of an entire decade. The bright, confident promises of the Roaring Twenties, examined so closely throughout the earlier chapters of this investigation, had given way to a starkly different American reality, one defined by breadlines, foreclosed homes, shuttered factories, and millions of ordinary families forced to rebuild their lives and their most basic sense of economic security from the ground up. The case file on 1929 does not end with the crash itself, nor even with the grinding hardship of the years that followed. It extends forward into the lessons this catastrophe would eventually teach an entire generation of policymakers, economists, and ordinary citizens. Lessons our investigation turns to examine next. Chapter 10. The greatest investigation in history. Who bears responsibility? Every proper investigation must eventually arrive at its central question, the question that has quietly driven every chapter that came before it. Who exactly is responsible for the catastrophe examined throughout this entire case file? Was the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it simply an unfortunate accident, an unpredictable convergence of unlucky circumstances that no reasonable person could have prevented? Or does careful examination of the evidence point toward genuine, identifiable failures, failures of judgment, failures of oversight, and failures of restraint, spread across multiple institutions and multiple groups of people, each of whom played a distinct and traceable role in building the catastrophe this investigation has documented? Let us examine each of the major parties in turn, weighing the evidence against each of them with the same careful attention this investigation has applied throughout every previous chapter. We begin with Wall Street itself, the financial district whose name has become permanently synonymous with this entire catastrophe. The evidence against Wall Street's own conduct throughout the 1920s is, in many respects, the most direct and most damning evidence in this entire case file. The stock exchanges and brokerage houses at the heart of the American financial system actively encouraged and profited from the speculative excess examined throughout earlier chapters of this investigation. Margin lending, the practice that allowed investors to purchase far more stock than their actual savings could support, was not merely tolerated by Wall Street's institutions. It was actively promoted because it generated substantial profits in the form of interest payments and trading commissions for the very brokers and financial firms extending these loans. Investment trusts, the increasingly complex, layered financial structures examined in an earlier chapter, were designed and sold by Wall Street's own institutions, often with promotional materials that emphasize potential gains while offering only minimal disclosure of the genuine risks involved. In the years before the crash, Wall Street's leading institutions possessed access to far more sophisticated financial information and far more experienced analytical judgment than the ordinary clerks, teachers, and taxi drivers pouring their savings into the market. And yet, as our earlier investigation into the final weeks before the crash revealed, a meaningful number of the market's most sophisticated professional participants appear to have recognized the danger and begun quietly protecting their own positions, even while continuing to publicly project confidence that encouraged millions of ordinary Americans to keep buying. This combination, profiting from excessive risk while failing to adequately warn the public bearing that risk, represents a genuine and significant failure of responsibility on the part of Wall Street's own institutions. Next, we turn to the American banking system, an institution whose conduct throughout this period reveals a related, though distinct, pattern of failure. As examined in earlier chapters, a great many banks throughout the 1920s had ventured far beyond their traditional conservative role of safely holding deposits and extending carefully evaluated loans. Banks increasingly involved themselves directly in stock market speculation, in some cases using depositors' own money to fund investment activities the depositors themselves had never knowingly authorized or even been made aware of. This represented a profound breach of the basic trust upon which the entire banking system depends, a trust that ordinary citizens extend to financial institutions specifically because they believe their savings will be handled with appropriate caution and care. When banks instead treated depositors' money as available capital for speculative investment, they exposed millions of ordinary families to risks those families had never knowingly agreed to accept, risks that ultimately materialized catastrophically in the wave of bank failures examined in the previous chapter. We turn next to the Federal Reserve, the institution specifically established to oversee the health and stability of the American financial and monetary system. The evidence against the Federal Reserve's conduct during this period is, in certain respects, more complicated than the evidence against Wall Street or the banking industry, because it involves not deliberate misconduct for profit, but genuine failures of judgment and policy, made by officials operating with incomplete understanding and imperfect tools during a genuinely unprecedented economic situation. As examined in an earlier chapter, the Federal Reserve's decision to tighten credit conditions during 1929, intended as a corrective measure to slow dangerous stock market speculation, arrived at a delicate moment when the broader economy was already weakened by the agricultural struggles, industrial overproduction, and widening income inequality examined throughout this investigation. Many economists studying this period have concluded that the Federal Reserve's policies, both in the lead up to the crash and, more significantly, in its immediate aftermath, actually worsened the resulting crisis rather than containing it. In the years following the crash, as banks across the country failed in overwhelming numbers, the Federal Reserve has been widely criticized by economic historians for failing to act as an effective lender of last resort, failing to provide the kind of emergency support to struggling banks that might have prevented at least some portion of the catastrophic wave of bank failures examined in the previous chapter. This represents a genuine failure of institutional responsibility. though one rooted more in miscalculation and limited understanding than in the kind of deliberate profit-seeking evident in the conduct of Wall Street's private institutions. We turn next to the United States government more broadly, an institution whose responsibility for this catastrophe involves both the years leading up to the crash and the critical early years of the depression that followed it. Throughout the 1920s, government regulation of the stock market and the broader financial system remained remarkably limited by later standards, leaving the kind of speculative excess and inadequate disclosure examined throughout this investigation largely unchecked by any meaningful official oversight. In the years immediately following the crash, government policy, shaped by the prevailing economic philosophy of the era, often prioritized balanced federal budgets and limited direct intervention in the economy, an approach that a great many economists studying this period have since concluded likely deepened and prolonged the resulting depression rather than helping to resolve it. It would not be until several years later, under an entirely new political administration and a substantially revised approach to economic policy, that the federal government would begin implementing the kind of active intervention and eventually the kind of meaningful financial regulation that later generations would come to view as essential safeguards against a repeat of this particular catastrophe. We turn next to the role of the press and popular media throughout this period, an institution whose responsibility, though less direct than that of Wall Street or the banking industry, nonetheless deserves careful examination. As documented throughout earlier chapters of this investigation, newspapers and popular magazines throughout the 1920s overwhelmingly emphasized celebratory stories of investment success, while offering comparatively little sustained attention to the more cautious warnings being raised by a smaller number of skeptical economists and financial analysts. This pattern of coverage, whether driven primarily by genuine editorial belief in the market's soundness, or simply by the commercial reality that success stories attracted more readers than cautious warnings, helped construct and sustain the widespread public confidence that ultimately drew millions of ordinary Americans into dangerously overextended speculative positions. The press did not create the underlying speculative excess examined throughout this investigation, but it played a significant role in amplifying and legitimizing that excess in the eyes of the wider public. Finally, we must turn to a factor that does not belong to any single institution, but which nonetheless played an essential role throughout this entire catastrophe: the psychology of the crowd itself. As examined throughout multiple chapters of this investigation, the speculative bubble of the late 1920s was sustained not merely by the actions of Wall Street, the banks, or the federal government, but by the genuine voluntary participation of millions of ordinary American citizens, each individually deciding to buy stock, often using borrowed money, in pursuit of a promised prosperity that increasingly bore little relationship to the underlying economic reality. This collective psychology, the fear of missing out, the trust placed in confident experts and celebrated success stories, the simple, deeply human desire to believe that a comfortable and secure future was readily available to anyone willing to participate, represents a genuine and significant factor in this catastrophe, one that cannot be assigned entirely to any single institution or group of decision-makers. Having examined the conduct and responsibility of each of these parties in turn, our investigation arrives at its central conclusion, a conclusion that resists the simpler, more satisfying narrative that popular retellings of this story often prefer. Was the crash of 1929 and the depression that followed it simply an accident, an unfortunate and unpredictable event that no reasonable observer could have anticipated or prevented? The evidence examined throughout this entire investigation does not support this conclusion. The warning signs were visible, documented at the time by economists and financial analysts whose cautions were largely ignored or dismissed. The speculative excess was, in significant part, actively encouraged by financial institutions that profited directly from that excess. The regulatory and institutional safeguards that might have contained or prevented this catastrophe were, throughout this period, either absent entirely or significantly inadequate to the scale of the risk actually building within the system. At the same time, does responsibility for this catastrophe rest entirely with any single, clearly identifiable villain, a single institution or individual whose deliberate malice or corruption can be said to have single-handedly caused this entire disaster? This conclusion, too, fails to withstand careful examination of the evidence. What this investigation reveals instead is something more complex, and in certain respects more genuinely troubling, than either of these simpler explanations. A convergence of distinct interlocking failures, poor judgment at the Federal Reserve, inadequate regulation and oversight by the federal government, genuine misconduct and excessive risk-taking by Wall Street's financial institutions, a profound breach of trust by banks that gambled with depositors' savings, media coverage that amplified rather than tempered public overconfidence, and a powerful, widely shared collective psychology that made millions of ordinary, reasonable individuals susceptible to the same dangerous overconfidence sweeping through the institutions meant to guide and protect them. This is, in the end, the most important and most enduring conclusion of our entire investigation. Catastrophes of this scale rarely emerge from a single cause, however tempting it may be to search for one clear villain capable of explaining everything. They emerge instead from the dangerous convergence of multiple interlocking failures, financial leverage without adequate restraint, institutional governance without sufficient oversight, and collective human psychology without the kind of skepticism and caution that might otherwise have slowed the building danger before it became unstoppable. The Great Depression did not have a single author. It had many, each contributing their own piece to a catastrophe. None of them, individually, may have fully intended or even recognized they were helping to build. Understanding this complex, interlocking web of responsibility, rather than searching for a single simple explanation, is essential to understanding not only what happened in 1929, but why similar warning signs, appearing in different forms across different decades since, so often continue to be ignored, even by generations who believe themselves to have learned this catastrophe's lessons. It is to those enduring lessons and to the question of what modern readers might still learn from this nearly century-old case file that our investigation turns in its final chapters. Chapter 11, The New Deal, America's Rescue. By the winter of 1932, more than 3 full years after the crash examined throughout this entire investigation, the United States stood at a genuine breaking point. Unemployment remained catastrophically high. Thousands of banks had already failed, with public confidence in the remaining institutions dangerously thin. Bread lines stretched through American cities, and makeshift shantytowns had become a familiar, painful feature of the national landscape. The existing federal government's approach, rooted in the belief that the economy would eventually correct itself if left largely undisturbed, had, after more than 3 years, produced little visible improvement. It was against this backdrop of exhausted patience and deepening desperation that American voters in the presidential election of November 1932 delivered a decisive verdict, sweeping a new president to office on a promise of direct, active government action. The new president took office in March of 1933, inheriting a nation and a financial system in a state of genuine crisis. In the days immediately surrounding his inauguration, the banking system itself stood on the edge of complete collapse. With a significant portion of American banks either already closed or facing the imminent threat of closure, as anxious depositors continued withdrawing their savings in a desperate attempt to protect whatever money remained. This was not, in other words, a leader inheriting a slowly recovering economy in need of modest adjustment. This was a leader inheriting a genuine, full-scale national emergency, one requiring immediate and dramatic action simply to prevent the complete collapse of the country's financial infrastructure. The new administration's first and most urgent priority involved addressing this crisis of confidence in the banking system directly, and the actions taken during the very first days of the new presidency remain, even today, closely studied examples of decisive crisis management. Within days of taking office, the new president declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank across the entire country, providing federal examiners with the necessary time to review each individual institution's actual financial condition before allowing it to reopen. This dramatic, unprecedented action was followed by a direct, reassuring radio address delivered to the American public, explaining calmly and clearly why the banks had been closed and what steps were being taken to ensure that the banks reopening in the days ahead were genuinely sound and safe for ordinary citizens to trust with their savings. This combination of decisive action and direct, honest communication proved remarkably effective. When banks began reopening in the days that followed, deposits, rather than continuing to flow out in a panicked wave of withdrawals, actually began flowing back in, as public confidence, so thoroughly shattered throughout the preceding years, began cautiously to recover. This initial success in stabilizing the banking system was only the opening move in a far broader and far more ambitious program of government action, one that would come to be known collectively as the New Deal, a sweeping series of policies and new government institutions designed to address simultaneously the immediate human suffering caused by the Depression and the deeper structural weaknesses in the American financial system that this entire investigation has documented throughout its earlier chapters. Let us examine several of the New Deal's most significant and most enduring components in turn. The first major area of action involved direct government employment, an approach designed to address the catastrophic unemployment examined in the previous chapter through immediate, practical action, rather than simply waiting for private industry to eventually recover on its own. A range of new government programs put millions of unemployed Americans directly to work on public projects, building roads, bridges, parks, schools, and other public infrastructure across the entire country, while simultaneously providing these workers and the families depending on them with the wages necessary to meet their most basic daily needs. Beyond the immediate, practical benefit of putting food on the table for millions of struggling families, these programs also served a broader economic purpose, injecting wages directly back into local economies across the country, wages that were then spent at local shops and businesses, helping to gradually rebuild the kind of consumer spending that private industry needed to eventually recover on its own. The second major area of action, and arguably the single most consequential reform to emerge from this entire era in terms of preventing a future repeat of 1929's catastrophe, involved the introduction of federal deposit insurance. As examined extensively throughout earlier chapters of this investigation, the wave of bank failures following the crash had devastated ordinary depositors precisely because no mechanism existed to protect their savings if their individual bank happened to fail. The New Deal addressed this fundamental vulnerability directly, establishing a federal program that guaranteed, up to a specified amount, that individual deposits would be protected even if the bank holding them ultimately collapsed. This single reform, though seemingly modest and technical on its surface, fundamentally transformed the psychology of banking in the United States. With their savings now genuinely protected regardless of any individual bank's fortunes, ordinary depositors no longer had the same rational incentive to panic and withdraw their money at the first sign of trouble, dramatically reducing the risk of the kind of self-reinforcing bank runs that had proven so devastating throughout the early years of the Depression. The third major area of action involved a direct structural reform of the banking industry itself, addressing the dangerous blending of ordinary depository banking with speculative investment activity that this investigation examined in earlier chapters as a significant contributing factor to the original crisis. New legislation enacted during this period established a clear, legally mandated separation between traditional commercial banks, institutions that did ordinary deposits and made conservative loans, and investment banks, institutions engaged in the kind of higher risk securities trading and underwriting activity examined throughout this investigation's earlier chapters. This separation was designed specifically to prevent banks from once again gambling with ordinary depositors' savings in pursuit of speculative investment profits, directly addressing one of the most significant institutional failures identified in the previous chapter's examination of responsibility for the original catastrophe. The fourth major area of action involved the direct regulation of the stock market itself, an area that, as examined throughout multiple earlier chapters of this investigation, had operated throughout the 1920s with remarkably little meaningful government oversight. New legislation established comprehensive new requirements for public companies to disclose accurate, meaningful financial information to potential investors, addressing the kind of inadequate disclosure that had allowed inflated stock prices to persist for so long without adequate public scrutiny. This same era also saw the establishment of an entirely new federal agency, specifically dedicated to overseeing the stock market and enforcing these new disclosure requirements, an agency whose fundamental mission, ensuring honest, transparent markets protected by meaningful regulatory oversight, would continue shaping American financial regulation for the remainder of the 20th century and well into the 21st. Taken together, these New Deal reforms represented, without question, the most significant transformation of the American government's relationship to its own financial system and its own economy in the nation's entire history, up to that point. But how effective were these reforms in practice at actually resolving the catastrophe this investigation has documented throughout its earlier chapters? This is a question that economists and historians continue to debate, even today, nearly a century later, and any honest investigation must acknowledge the genuine complexity and continued disagreement surrounding this question. On one hand, the New Deal's achievements in stabilizing the immediate banking crisis and in establishing lasting structural reforms like federal deposit insurance and meaningful securities regulation are widely regarded across a broad range of economic and political perspectives as genuine and lasting successes, reforms that fundamentally strengthened the resilience of the American financial system against exactly the kind of catastrophic collapse examined throughout this investigation's earlier chapters. The banking panics that had so devastated American communities throughout the early 1930s largely ceased once these reforms took hold, and the basic regulatory framework established during this period continued providing meaningful protection to ordinary depositors and investors for many decades afterward. On the other hand, considerable debate continues among economists regarding exactly how effective the New Deal's broader employment and economic stimulus programs were at actually ending the Depression itself, as opposed to simply easing its most severe immediate hardships. Unemployment, while it did decline meaningfully during the years following the New Deal's initial implementation, remained significantly elevated throughout the entire remainder of the 1930s, and a great many economists studying this period have concluded that it was not, in fact, the New Deal's own programs, but rather the massive government spending associated with the buildup to the Second World War later in the decade that ultimately provided the scale of economic stimulus genuinely necessary to restore full employment across the American economy. This remains, even today, one of the more genuinely contested questions among economic historians studying this period, a debate that reflects deeper, ongoing disagreements about the most effective role of government intervention during periods of severe economic crisis. What can be said with considerably greater confidence, and what represents perhaps the single most enduring lesson to emerge from this particular chapter of our investigation, involves the broader question of crisis governance itself, the practical lessons this period offers regarding how governments can most effectively respond once a genuine financial catastrophe has already taken hold. The New Deal era demonstrates, with considerable historical clarity, the genuine value of swift, decisive action during the earliest days of a financial panic, the kind of immediate, confidence-restoring intervention demonstrated so effectively during the initial bank holiday examined earlier in this chapter. It demonstrates the lasting value of addressing not merely the immediate symptoms of a crisis, but its underlying structural causes, exemplified by reforms like federal deposit insurance and meaningful securities regulation that directly targeted the specific institutional failures this investigation identified throughout its earlier chapters. And it demonstrates, perhaps most importantly of all, the genuine, lasting value of clear, honest public communication during moments of widespread fear and uncertainty, the kind of direct, reassuring communication that helped restore public confidence in the banking system during those critical early days of 1933. These lessons, forged during the darkest years of the Great Depression, would go on to influence government responses to financial crises for the remainder of the 20th century and well into the 21st. A direct, lasting legacy of the catastrophe this entire investigation has traced from its earliest origins in the Roaring Twenties through its most devastating consequences during the early years of the Great Depression. It is to the broader, enduring legacy of this entire catastrophe and to the question of what today's readers might still learn from this nearly century-old case file that our investigation now turns in its concluding chapters. Chapter 12, The File That Never Closes. Why 1929 Still Haunts the World. Every genuine investigation, once it has traced its evidence back to its origins and forward through its consequences, must eventually ask one final, uncomfortable question. Is this truly a closed case, a tragedy safely confined to the history books, or does the pattern uncovered throughout this investigation continue to repeat itself in new forms long after the original participants have passed from living memory? To answer this question, our investigation must leave the 1920s and 1930s behind entirely and travel forward across nearly 8 decades to a financial crisis that erupted in 2008, one that a great many economists, journalists, and ordinary citizens immediately and almost instinctively began comparing to the catastrophe this entire case file has documented. The similarities, once examined closely, are genuinely striking and genuinely unsettling. Consider first the role of asset bubbles in both crises. In 1929's, as this investigation has documented extensively, stock prices climbed to levels that bore less and less relationship to the actual underlying earnings of the companies whose shares were being traded, driven instead by widespread speculation and the simple, self-reinforcing belief that prices would continue rising indefinitely. In 2008, a strikingly similar dynamic unfolded, not primarily in the stock market itself, but in the American housing market, where home prices climbed to levels increasingly disconnected from the actual incomes of the families purchasing them, driven by a similarly widespread belief that housing prices, much like stock prices in the earlier era, simply could not fall. Consider, second, the role of debt and financial leverage in both crises. 1929, as examined extensively throughout this investigation, was built substantially on margin lending, allowing investors to purchase stock using only a small fraction of their own genuine capital, with the remainder borrowed against the value of the stock itself. 2008 was built on a strikingly similar foundation, though expressed through different financial instruments, as mortgage lending standards loosened dramatically throughout the preceding years, allowing home buyers and the complex financial institutions that packaged and resold their mortgages to take on levels of debt that assumed housing prices, much like stock prices 8 decades earlier, would simply continue climbing indefinitely. Consider, third, the role of financial institutions themselves in both crises. In 1929, as this investigation documented in an earlier chapter, banks blurred the traditional cautious boundary between ordinary depository banking and higher risk speculative investment, exposing ordinary depositors to risks they had never knowingly agreed to accept. In 2008, a remarkably similar pattern unfolded, as large financial institutions created and traded increasingly complex financial instruments built on top of mortgage debt, instruments so layered and so difficult to fully understand that even many of the professionals trading them struggled to accurately assess the genuine risk hidden within them, echoing the layered investment trusts examined in this investigation's earlier chapters on the 1920s bubble. Consider finally the role of panic itself in both crises. 1929, as this investigation documented extensively across its central chapters, demonstrated how quickly confidence, once broken, can transform an orderly market into a chaotic, self-reinforcing collapse, as forced selling triggers further forced selling in a downward spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to halt. 2008 demonstrated this same essential dynamic, as the failure of several major financial institutions triggered a rapid, cascading loss of confidence throughout the entire global financial system, freezing credit markets and threatening for a genuinely alarming period to trigger a banking collapse on a scale not seen since the very crisis this investigation has spent its entire length examining. These parallels are not, of course, perfectly exact. The specific financial instruments involved, the particular institutions at the center of each crisis, and the specific policy responses ultimately deployed all differed in important, meaningful ways between these two eras, separated as they were by nearly 8 decades of evolving financial technology, evolving regulation, and evolving economic understanding. But the underlying pattern, an asset bubble built on unsustainable optimism, amplified by excessive debt and financial leverage, sustained by inadequate institutional oversight, and ultimately unwound through a sudden, devastating collapse in collective confidence, remains, across both crises, remarkably, almost eerily consistent. This raises the central question this final chapter must confront directly. If the underlying pattern connecting 1929 and 2008 is so consistent, what practical lessons can modern investors, modern policymakers, and ordinary modern citizens actually draw from this nearly century-old case file? Lessons that might help them recognize and perhaps even avoid the next iteration of this same dangerous pattern. Several lessons emerge clearly from the evidence this investigation has examined throughout its earlier chapters. The first lesson involves a fundamental skepticism toward any claim that a market has entered a permanently new era in which the ordinary rules of economic gravity no longer apply. As this investigation documented in an earlier chapter, prominent, genuinely respected economists in 1929 confidently declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau, a declaration that history would prove catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong within a matter of days. Any modern investor encountering similarly confident claims that a particular asset class simply cannot fall, that traditional measures of value no longer meaningfully apply, that this time is genuinely different from every previous speculative episode in recorded financial history, would do well to remember exactly how confidently and exactly how wrongly similar claims were made in the autumn of 1929. The second lesson involves a clear, sober understanding of financial leverage and its genuinely dangerous, double-edged nature. As this investigation demonstrated extensively throughout its examination of margin lending, borrowed money can dramatically amplify gains during a rising market, but it amplifies losses with exactly the same ferocity when that market inevitably turns. Any modern investor considering the use of significant borrowed money, whether through stock market margin accounts, real estate financing, or any other form of leveraged investment, should approach that decision with a clear-eyed understanding of precisely how quickly leverage can transform a manageable market decline into genuine, potentially devastating financial ruin. The third lesson involves the genuine importance of managing one's own emotional responses during periods of both market euphoria and market panic. As this investigation demonstrated throughout its examination of the fear of missing out that drove so much of the 1920s speculative bubble, and the subsequent panic that drove the catastrophic selling of Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, human emotional responses to rising and falling markets tend to push investors toward precisely the wrong decisions at precisely the wrong moments, encouraging excessive buying near market peaks and panicked selling near market bottoms. Recognizing this well-documented pattern of human psychology and consciously working to resist its pull remains one of the most difficult and most genuinely valuable disciplines any investor can cultivate. The fourth lesson involves the practical value of diversification, spreading investments across multiple different assets and asset classes, rather than concentrating wealth heavily in a single market or a single speculative trend. A great many of the individual tragedies documented throughout this investigation's examination of Black Tuesday's human cost involved investors who had concentrated an overwhelming portion of their entire financial security in stock market speculation, often amplified further through borrowed margin money, leaving them with no meaningful cushion once that single concentrated bet collapsed. The fifth and final lesson involves the practical importance of maintaining genuine financial liquidity readily accessible cash or cash equivalent savings that do not depend on the continued rise of any particular speculative asset. Many of the investors examined throughout this investigation's account of the crash's immediate aftermath found themselves unable to meet even modest financial obligations, specifically because their entire financial position had become tied up in stock holdings that had, almost overnight, become worth a small fraction of their previous value, or, in some cases, worth less than nothing once the associated margin debt was properly accounted for. Beyond these practical lessons, our investigation must acknowledge, honestly and directly, that certain genuine uncertainties surrounding this case remain unresolved, even after nearly a century of careful historical and economic analysis. Could the catastrophe examined throughout this entire investigation genuinely have been avoided? Had different policy decisions been made at critical moments by the Federal Reserve, by federal regulators, or by the banking industry itself? Did a meaningful number of sophisticated financial insiders genuinely foresee the coming collapse well before the general public did, as this investigation's examination of October 1929's final weeks suggested? And if so, did they bear some additional moral responsibility for continuing to project public confidence even as they quietly protected their own positions? These questions continue to generate genuine, substantive disagreement among serious historians and economists, disagreement that this investigation, despite its thorough examination of the available evidence, cannot claim to fully and definitively resolve. What can be said with considerably greater confidence, however, is this: the underlying human psychology that drove the catastrophe examined throughout this entire case file, the powerful, deeply human combination of greed during periods of rising prosperity and genuine paralyzing fear during periods of sudden collapse, remains, nearly a century later, essentially unchanged. Modern financial markets operate with tools and technologies that investors in 1929 could scarcely have imagined: instantaneous digital trading, artificial intelligence-driven investment algorithms, and vast, interconnected social media networks capable of spreading both confidence and panic with a speed the telephone lines and ticker tapes of 1929 could never have matched. And yet, the fundamental human vulnerabilities this investigation has traced throughout its 12 chapters, the susceptibility to collective overconfidence, the danger of excessive borrowed leverage, and the devastating speed with which confidence can collapse into panic, remain every bit as relevant to these new, faster, more technologically sophisticated markets as they were to the crowded trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange in the autumn of 1929. And so this investigation closes, in the tradition of any properly thorough case file, not with a single tidy, fully resolved conclusion, but with a question left deliberately, honestly open for you, the listener, to sit with. Imagine yourself standing on Wall Street on the morning of the 29th of October, 1929, watching the opening bell ring, watching the first wave of panicked selling begin to build around you. Would you have recognized the warning signs this investigation has traced so carefully across its earlier chapters? Would you have sold, protecting whatever remained of your own position before the worst of the collapse arrived? Would you have bought, trusting, as so many confident voices around you continued insisting that this was merely a temporary healthy correction before the market's inevitable permanent climb resumed? Or would you simply have waited, frozen, as millions of ordinary Americans did, uncertain which voice to trust amid the chaos and conflicting reassurance swirling around you? And perhaps more importantly, as you consider your own answer to that question, consider this second, equally difficult question alongside it. If a genuinely similar speculative bubble were to emerge today, amplified by artificial intelligence, by social media, and by algorithmic trading systems capable of executing millions of transactions in the time it once took a single ticker tape machine to print a single price, would human beings, even now, even armed with the hard-won lessons of 1929 examined throughout this entire investigation, truly behave any differently? This is the enduring, unsettling truth at the heart of this entire case file. The Great Depression of 1929 is not simply a story confined to the past. It is a kind of decoded pattern, a permanent record of exactly how greed, fear, and collective human psychology can drive any market, in any era, from the giddy heights of euphoric confidence down into the depths of genuine, devastating panic. This is precisely why this particular case file, though nearly a full century old, has never truly been closed, and why it likely never fully will be, so long as human beings continue building markets and continue, generation after generation, forgetting the hard-earned lessons of the generation that came before them.